who is causing global warming or other climate disasters. Keep in mind, even the EPA director appointed by President Obama agrees that that would not reduce any CO2 worldwide. With that, I'll yield the floor.
The Republican whip.
Madam President, I'd ask unanimous consent that following my remarks, the Senator from Kentucky, Senator Paul, be recognized.
Without objection.
Madam President, I'm not sure where the Obama administration is getting all of its talking points on the sequester, but the President might want to consider hiring a fact checker. Even before the sequester took effect, Education Secretary Arne Duncan declared that school teachers were getting pink slips. A few days later, he had to walk those comments back. He said he was referring to a single school in West Virginia, but when the Washington Post contacted the superintendent of that school, he said that not one teacher had gotten a pink slip because of the sequester. Then President Obama suggested that all of the people who keep the Capitol clean would be suffering a pay cut. But that wasn't true either, according to Capitol Superintendent Carlos Elias. We've been repeatedly told that the sequester would trigger drastic layoffs of federal workers. Yet on Monday alone, the federal government posted literally hundreds of job advertisements. Finally, just yesterday, when asked to provide evidence for the claim that 70,000 children would be denied access to Head Start, because of the sequester, the White House had no details. While the President's been out there playing Chicken Little, members of Congress have been waiting for the White House to send over its budget. The law requires the President to transmit a budget by February the 4th, and we've been now advised his budget won't be forthcoming until March the 25th. Ironically, that will actually be after the House and the Senate have taken up our own budget, and we will have no input from the President on his proposal. A few weeks ago, I said that a second term offers the President a second chance, and I still remain hopeful that President Obama will eventually be persuaded to adopt a serious approach for long-term deficit reduction and long-term economic growth. One of the great tragedies in America today is the fact our economy is growing so slowly that unemployment rates remain unacceptably high, roughly around 8%, and that's only after many people have simply given up looking for work. Now more than 20 million people either are out of work or they are working part-time when they would prefer to work full-time. But that's not going to happen until we get the economy growing again, and that's not going to happen until we get our hands around our long-term deficit and economic growth. I realize that the President wants to take, the Democrats want to take the House of Representatives back in 2014. The President probably remembers the halcyon days of 2009 and 2010 when his party controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House. That got us Obamacare, a $1 trillion stimulus, and a whole lot more debt, and the Dodd-Frank law, which was targeted at Wall Street, but which hit Main Street, including a lot of our community bankers. There's a time for campaigning, and there's a time for governing. But the 2012 election occurred 17 weeks ago, and the 2014 election won't occur for another 20 months. Now is the time for governing, not for delivering more partisan stump speeches. And in order to govern, the Senate needs to pass a budget, something this chamber hasn't done for more than 1,400 days. Over that same period, our gross national debt has grown by $5.5 trillion. And we've experienced the weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression. Since the official end of the recession in June of 2009, the median household income in America has fallen by more than $2,400. Meanwhile, since the President took office, the cost of family health insurance has increased by $2,300. So not only is household income for most Americans, the median household income that is, dropped by $2,400. They're seeing an additional burden of $2,300 because of Obamacare. The bottom line is the American people are tired of the Chicken Little stories, and they're tired of the fear-mongering. They look at what's happening in Washington. I know my constituents in Texas do, and they almost want to turn their eyes in another direction to avert their gaze because they understand that Washington is not serving their interests. If President Obama wants real change, it's time for him to get behind real tax reform and real reform of Social Security and Medicare, something his own bipartisan fiscal commission, Simpson-Bowles, recommended. After all, the American people didn't send us here to kick and scream over a 2.4% budget cut. They sent us here to make some hard decisions that are necessary to ensure long-term fiscal health and long-term economic prosperity. And it's time for the President, as the leader of our country and the leader of the free world, to take that message to heart. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
The senator from Kentucky.
I rise today to begin to filibuster John Brennan's nomination for the CIA. I will speak until I can no longer speak. I will speak as long as it takes until the alarm is sounded from coast to coast that our Constitution is important, that your rights to trial by jury are precious, that no American should be killed by a drone on American soil without first being charged with a crime, without first being found to be guilty by a court, that Americans could be killed in a cafe in San Francisco or in a restaurant in Houston or at their home in Bowling Green, Kentucky, is an abomination. It is something that should not and cannot be tolerated in our country. I don't rise to oppose John Brennan's nomination simply for the person. I rise today for the principle. The principle is one that as Americans we have fought long and hard for, and to give up on that principle, to give up on the Bill of Rights, to give up on the Fifth Amendment protection that says that no person shall be held without due process, that no person shall be held for a capital offense without being indicted. This is a precious American tradition and something we should not give up on easily. They say Lewis Carroll is fiction. Alice never fell down a rabbit hole, and the White Queen's caustic judgments are not really a threat to your security. Or has America the Beautiful become Alice's Wonderland? No, no, said the Queen. Sentence first, verdict afterwards. Stuff and nonsense, Alice said loudly. The idea of having the sentence first? Hold your tongue, said the Queen, turning purple. I won't, said Alice. Release the drones, said the Queen, as she shouted at the top of her voice. Lewis Carroll is fiction, right? When I asked the President, can you kill an American on American soil, it should have been an easy answer. It's an easy question. It should have been a resounding and unequivocal no. The President's response, he hasn't killed anyone yet. We're supposed to be comforted by that. The President says, I haven't killed anyone yet. He goes on to say, and I have no intention of killing Americans, but I might. Is that enough? Are we satisfied by that? Are we so complacent with our rights that we would allow a president to say he might kill Americans, but he will judge the circumstances? He will be the sole arbiter. He will be the sole decider. He will be the executioner-in-chief if he sees fit. Now, some would say he would never do this. Many people give the president they give him consideration. They say he's a good man. I'm not arguing that he's not. What I'm arguing is that the law is there and set in place for the day when angels don't rule government. Madison said that the restraint on government was because government will not always be run by angels. This has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with whether the president is a Democrat or a Republican. Were this a Republican president, I'd be here saying exactly the same thing. No one person, no one politician should be allowed to judge the guilt, to charge an individual, to judge the guilt of an individual, and to execute an individual. It goes against everything that we fundamentally believe in our country. This isn't even new to our country. There's 800 years of English law that we found our tradition upon. We found it upon the Magna Carta from 1215. We found it upon Morgan of Glamorgan from 725 A.D. We found it upon the Greeks and Romans who had juries. It is not enough to charge someone to say that they are guilty. Now, some might come to this floor and they might say, well, what if we're being attacked on 9/11? What if there are planes flying at the Twin Towers? Obviously, we repel them. We repel any attack on our country. If there's a gentleman or a woman with a grenade launcher attacking our buildings or our Capitol, we use lethal force. You don't get due process if you're involved with actively attacking us, our soldiers, or our government. You don't get due process if you're overseas in a battle shooting at our soldiers. But that's not what we're talking about. The Wall Street Journal reported and said that the bulk of the drone attacks are signature attacks. They don't even know the name of the person. A line or a caravan is going from a place where we think there are bad people to a place where we think they might commit harm, and we kill the caravan, not the person. Is that the standard that we will now use in America? Will we use a standard for killing Americans to be that we thought you were bad, we thought you were coming from a meeting with bad people, and you were in a line of traffic, and so therefore you were fined for the killing? That is the standard we're using overseas. Is that the standard we're going to use here? I will speak today until the president responds and says, no, we won't kill Americans in cafes. No, we won't kill you at home in your bed at night. No, we won't drop bombs on restaurants. Is that so hard? It's amazing that the president will not respond. I've been asking this question for a month. It's like pulling teeth to get the president to respond to anything. And I get no answer. The president says he hasn't done it yet, and I'm to be comforted. You are to be comforted in your home. You are to be comforted in your restaurant. You are to be comforted online communicating in your email that the president hasn't killed an American yet on the homeland. He says he hasn't done it yet. He says he has no intention to do so. Hayek said that nothing distinguishes arbitrary government from a government that is run by the whims of the people than the rule of law. The law is an amazingly important thing, an amazingly important protection. And for us to give up on it so easily really doesn't speak well of what our founding fathers fought for, what generation after generation of American soldiers have fought for, what soldiers are fighting for today when they go overseas to fight wars for us. It doesn't speak well of what we're doing here to protect the freedom at home. When our soldiers are abroad fighting for us, that we say that our freedom's not precious enough for one person to come down and say, enough's enough, Mr. President. Come clean, come forward and say you will not kill Americans on American soil. The oath of office of the President says that he will, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. He raises his hand, his right hand, and puts his left hand on the Bible, and he says, I will. The President doesn't say, I intend to if it's convenient. I intend to unless circumstances dictate otherwise. The President says, I will defend the Constitution. I will protect the Constitution. There isn't room for equivocation here, Mr. President. This is something that is so important, so fundamental to our country, that he needs to come forward. when Brennan, whose nomination now I'm posing today, was asked directly, is there any limit to your killing? Is there any geographic limitation to your drone strike program? Brennan responded and said no. There is no limitation. So the obvious question would be, if there's no limitation to whom you can kill and where you can kill, and there's no brute due process upon whom you will kill, does that mean you will do it in America? So the senator from Oregon asked him that question directly in committee. And this so-called champion of transparency, this so-called advocate of some kind of process, responded to the senator from Oregon by saying, I plan to optimize secrecy and optimize transparency. Gobbledygook. You were asked, will you kill Americans on American soil? Answer the question. Our laws forbid the CIA from doing that. It should have been an easy question. The 1947 National Security Act says the CIA doesn't operate in our country. We have the FBI. We have rules. We've separated powers to protect your rights. That's what government was organized to do. That's what the Constitution was put in place to do, to protect your rights. So when asked, he says, no answer. He says, I will evade your answer. And by letting him come forward, we let him get away with it. So I have hounded and hounded and hounded, and finally yesterday I get a response from Mr. Brennan, who wishes to be the CIA chief, and he finally says, I will obey the law. Well, hooray. Good for him. It took a month to get him to admit that he will obey the law. But it's not so simple. You see, the drone strike program is under the Department of Defense. So when the CIA says they're not going to kill you in America, they're not saying the Defense Department won't. So Eric Holder sent a response, the Attorney General, and his response says, haven't killed anyone yet. I don't intend to kill anyone, but I might. And he pulls out examples that really aren't under consideration. There is the use of lethal force that can always be repelled. If our country is attacked, the president has the right to defend and protect the country. Nobody questions that. Nobody questions if planes are flying towards the Twin Towers, whether they can be repulsed by the military. Nobody questions whether a terrorist with a rocket launcher or a grenade launcher is attacking us, whether they can be repelled. They don't get their day in court. But if you are sitting in a cafeteria in Dearborn, if you happen to be an Arab American who has a relative in the Middle East and you communicate with them by email, and somebody says, oh, your relative is someone we suspect of being associated with terrorism, is that enough to kill you? For goodness sakes, wouldn't we try to arrest and come to the truth by having a jury and a presentation of facts on both sides of the issue? See, the real problem here, one of the things we did a long time ago, is we separated the police power from the judicial power. This was an incredibly important first step. We also prevented the military from acting in our country because we didn't want to have a police state. One of the things that we greatly objected to with the British were that they were passing out what were called general writs, or writs of assistance. These were warrants that allowed them to go into a house, but allowed them to go into anyone's house. And so what we did when we wrote our Constitution is we made the Constitution, we made the Fourth Amendment specific to the person and the place and the things to be looked for. We didn't like the soldiers going willy-nilly into any house and looking for anything. So we made our Constitution much more specific. I think this is something we shouldn't give up on so easily. I think that the idea that we could deprive someone of their life without any kind of hearing, essentially allowing a politician. I'm not casting any aspersions on the president. I'm not saying he's a bad person at all, but he's not a judge. He's a politician. And he was elected by a majority, but the majority doesn't get to decide who we execute. We have a process for deciding this. We have courts for deciding this. To allow one man to accuse you in secret, you never get notified you've been accused. Your notification is the buzz of the propellers on the drone as it flies overhead in the seconds before you're killed. Is that what we really want from our government? Are we so afraid of terrorism? Are we so afraid of terrorists that we're willing to just throw out our rights and our freedoms, things that have been fought for and that we have gotten over the centuries? At least 800 years, if not 1,000 years worth of protection. Originally, the protections were against a monarch. We feared a monarch. We didn't like having a monarch. We came to this country, and so when we set up our presidency, there was a great deal of alarm. There was a great deal of fear over having a king. And so we limited the executive branch. Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, he said that the Constitution supposes what history demonstrates, that the executive branch is the branch most prone to war, most likely to go to war, and therefore we took that power to declare war and we vested it in the legislature. We broke up the powers. Montesquieu wrote about the checks and balances and the separation of powers, and he was somebody that Jefferson looked towards. They separated the powers because there's a chance for abuse of power when power resides in one person. Montesquieu said that there can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the legislative. I would say something similar. There can be no liberty when you combine the executive and the judiciary. That's what we're doing here. We're allowing the president to be the accuser in secret, and we're allowing him to be the judge, and we're allowing him to be the jury. No man should have that power. We should fear that power. Not because we have to say, oh, we fear the current president. It has nothing to do with who the president is. It has nothing to do with whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It has to do with whether or not you fear the consolidation of power. Whether you fear power being given to one person, whether a Republican or a Democrat. This is not necessarily a right-left issue. Kevin Gostola, who writes at Fire Dog Lake, writes, the mere fact that the president's answer to this question, whether you can kill an American on American soil, that the president's answer was yes, is outrageous. However, it fits the framework for fighting a permanent global war on terrorism without any geographic limitations, which the President Obama's administration, has maintained that it has the authority to wage. What's important here is that we're talking about a war without geographic limitations, but we're also talking about a war without temporal limitations. There is no limit in time to this war. When will this war end? It's a war that has, I think, an infinite timeline. So if you're going to suspend your rights, if there's going to be no geographic limits to killing, which really means we're not at war in Afghanistan, we're at war everywhere, and everybody that pops up is called Al-Qaeda now, whether they've ever heard of Al-Qaeda or not, whether they have any communication with some kind of network of Al-Qaeda, everybody is Al-Qaeda. But there's a new war or an ongoing war everywhere in the world. There's no limitations. Glenn Greenwald has written also about this subject, and he was speaking at the Freedom to Connect conference, and he says there is a theoretical framework being built that posits that the U.S. government has unlimited power. Some call this inherent power. Inherent means it hasn't been defined anywhere. It hasn't been expressly given to the government. They've just decided this is their power. They're going to grab it and take what they can get. And this isn't new. The Bush administration did some of this too. When the Bush administration tried to grab power, though, on the left and some of us on the right were critical. When they tried to wiretap phones without a warrant, we raised a ruckus, many on the right and many on the left. There was a loud outcry against President Bush for usurping, going across due process, not allowing due process, not obeying the restraints of warrants. Where is that outcry now? Glenn Greenwald writes, there's a theoretical framework being built that posits that the U.S. government has unlimited power. When it comes to any kind of threats it perceives, it makes the judgment. to take whatever action against them that it warrants without any constraints or limitations of any kind. As Greenwald suggests, this is going back to Gastola's words, as Greenwald suggests, answering yes to the question that you can kill Americans on American soil illustrates the real radicalism that the government has embraced in terms of how it uses its own power. To think that we were opposed to them listening to your conversations without a warrant, but no one's going to stand up and say they can kill you without a warrant, a judge's review, or a jury, no one's going to object to that. Where's the cacophony that stood up and said, how can you tap my phone without going to a judge first? I asked, how can you kill someone without going to a judge or a jury? Are we going to give up our rights to politicians, to any politician of any stripe? Are we going to give up the right to decide who lives and who dies? Gastola goes on to say that the reason the administration didn't want to answer yes or no to this question of can you kill Americans on American soil, because he says that a no answer would jeopardize the critical theoretical foundation that they have very carefully constructed that says there are no cognizable constraints on how U.S. government power can be asserted. Civil libertarians once expected more from the president. In fact, it was one of the things that I liked about the president. I'm a Republican. I didn't vote or support the president either time. But I admired him, particularly in 2007 when he ran. I admired his ability to stand up and say, we won't torture people. That's not what America does. How does the president's mind work, though? The president that seems so honorable, seems so concerned with our rights, seems so concerned with the right not to have your phone be tapped, now says he's not concerned with whether you can be killed without a trial? The leap of logic is so fantastic as to boggle the mind. Where is the Barack Obama of 2007? Has the presidency so transformed him that he has forgotten his moorings, forgotten what he stood for? Civil libertarians once expected more from the president. Ask any civil libertarian whether or not the president should have the right to arbitrarily kill Americans on American soil, and the answer is easy. Of course, no president should have the right or that power under the Constitution. Now, Brennan has responded in committee that the CIA now does not have the right to do it on American soil. The problem is that this program is under the Department of Defense, so it's once again an evasive answer, not answering the true question, will the government of America kill Americans on American soil? Gastola from Fire Dog Lake writes, there may never be a targeted killing of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil, and the question of whether a U.S. citizen could be targeted and killed on U.S. soil may remain a hypothetical question for some time. But the fact that the Obama administration has told a U.S. senator that there is a circumstance where the government could target and kill an American citizen on American soil without charge and without trial is a stark example of an imperial presidency. This is what our founding fathers wanted to fight against. They wanted to limit the role and the power of the president. They wanted to check the president's power with the power of the Senate, with the power of the House, with the power of the judiciary. Three co-equal branches. Not one of them should be able to run roughshod on the other. The problem has become is that we have allowed this to happen. Not me personally, but Congress in general has allowed the president to usurp this power. If there were an ounce of courage in this body, I would be joined by many other senators saying that they will not tolerate this, that we will come together today in bipartisan fashion and tell the president, tell any president, that no president will ever have the authority to kill Americans without a trial. Now, when the president says he doesn't intend to do so, you really have to think that through. The president a year ago signed a law that says that you can be detained indefinitely, that you can be sent from America to Guantanamo Bay without a trial. And he wants us to be comforted. He wants us to remember and think good of him because he says, I don't intend to do so. Well, it's not enough. I mean, would you tolerate a Republican who stood up and said, well, I like the First Amendment. I'm quite fond of the First Amendment. And I don't intend to break the First Amendment, but I might. Would conservatives tolerate someone who said, I like the Second Amendment? I think it's important, and I'm for gun ownership, and I don't intend to violate the Second Amendment, but I might. Would we tolerate that he doesn't intend to do so as a standard? We have to think about the standards being used overseas. The president finally admitted, they interviewed him at Google not too long ago. They interviewed him and they asked him, can you kill Americans at home? And he was evasive, but he said if there are rules, he said the rules will be different outside than inside. Well, I certainly hope so. Outside the United States, the rules for killing are you can kill someone through a signature strike. We don't have to know what your name is, who you are, who you're with. If you're in a line of traffic and we think you're going from talking to bad people to talking to other bad people, we'll kill you. I mean, is that going to be the standard in America? Now, when they're questioned about, have you killed civilians in your drone strikes, they say no. But they don't count you as a civilian if you're a male or if you're between the ages of 16 and 50. You're a potential and a probable combatant if that's your age range. So my question is, if you're not a civilian, if you're in proximity to bad people, is that the standard we're going to use in the United States? So if we're going to kill Americans on American soil and the standard's going to be signature strikes, that you're close to bad people or that you're in the same proximity as bad people, would that be enough? Are we happy with that standard? Are we happy there'll be no jury, no trial, no charges, nothing done publicly? In Eric Holder's response, the Attorney General's response to me, they maintain they're not going to do this, just trust them. It's not really about them, though. It is about the law. The law restrains everyone equally, regardless of your party, whether you're Republican or Democrat. The law is out there for the time when somebody inadvertently elects a really bad person. You know, when World War II ended, the currency was being destroyed in Germany, 1923, the paper money became so worthless that people wheeled it in wheelbarrows. They burned it for fuel. It became virtually worthless overnight. The beginning of September 1923, the paper, I think it was like 10, 15 marks for a loaf of bread. September 14th, it was 1,000 marks. September 30th, it was 100,000 marks. October 15th, it was a couple of million marks for a loaf of bread. It was a chaotic situation. Out of that chaos, Hitler was elected democratically. They elected him out of this chaos. The point isn't that anybody in our country is Hitler. I'm not accusing anybody of being that evil. I think it's an overplayed and a misused analogy. But what I am saying is that in a democracy, you could someday elect someone who is very evil. That's why we don't give the power to the government. And it's not an accusation of this president or anybody in this body. It's a point to be made historically that occasionally even a democracy gets it wrong. So when a democracy gets it wrong, you want the law to be there in place. You want this rule of law. As I mentioned, Hayek said that this is what distinguishes us. Nothing distinguishes us more clearly from arbitrary government and a government of whims and a rule of law, and a stable and consistent government as the rule of law. Heritage has an author who's written some about the oath of office. His name's Kasavin, and he writes that the location and the phrasing of the oath of office for the president, and this is something I mentioned earlier, that the president says he will protect and defend and preserve the Constitution. The oath is, words are important. The oath doesn't say I intend to preserve, protect, and defend. It says I will. Kasavin writes, though, that the location and phrasing of the oath of office strongly suggests that it's not empowering but limiting. So the president doesn't take an oath of office that says, I intend to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, but I also feel that I have inherent powers that were never mentioned by anybody, that I will be the sole arbiter of interpreting what those powers are. That sounds more like a king. That's not what we wanted. We did not want an imperial presidency. What Kasavin suggests is that the oath of office is not empowering, but that it is limiting, that the clause limits the president and how the president can execute or how the executive power can be exercised. One unanswered word in that Constitution includes the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. What does the Fifth Amendment say? The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury. It's pretty explicit. The Fifth Amendment protects you. It protects you from a king placing you in the tower, but it also should protect you from a president that might kill you with a drone. We were granted due process. It's not always easy to sort out the details of who is a threat to the country and who's not a threat to the country. If it were people with grenade launchers on their shoulder, that's easy. And in fact, I agree completely. You don't get due process if you're actively attacking America. But you have to realize that there have been reports that over half of the drone strikes overseas are not even directed towards an individual. They're directed towards a caravan of unnamed individuals. You also have to realize that overseas, I have no problems. If people are shooting at American soldiers, by all means, they get no due process. But you also have to realize that many, we don't know because they won't tell us the number, but many of the drone strikes overseas are done when you're walking, I don't know where you're walking, to church, you're walking to a restaurant, you're walking along the road. They're done when you're in a car driving. They're done when you're in a house eating. They're done when you're in a restaurant eating. They're done when you're in a home sleeping. And I'm not even saying all those people don't deserve what they got. But I am saying that they're not actively involved in something that's an imminent threat, and if they were in America, they would be arrested. If we think you're a terrorist in America, we should arrest you. But here's the question, who is a terrorist? That's why I've been so concerned with a lot around here that want to say if you're associated with terrorism. The reason is that your government has already put out things that I think are of questionable nature. The Bureau of Justice put out a bulletin within the last year describing people who you need to be worried about. These are the people that you're supposed to say something. If you see something, you're supposed to say something. Who are these terrorists that live among you? People who might be missing fingers on one hand, people who might have stains on their clothing, people who might have changed the color of their hair, people who like to pay in cash, people who own more than one gun, people who own weatherized ammunition, people who have 7 days of food in their house. These are people that you should be afraid of and that you should report to your government. So says your government. Are they going to be on the drone strike list? I think we need to get an answer from the president. If you're going to kill people in America, we need rules, and we want to know what your rules are. Because I certainly don't want to have 7 days of food in my house if that's on the list for terrorism. Interestingly, on government websites, there are some government websites that advise you to have food in your house. If you live in a hurricane-prone area, you're supposed to keep some extra food around. Who's going to decide when it's okay to have food in your house and when it's not? There's something called fusion centers. Fusion centers are something that are supposed to coordinate between the federal government and the local government to find terrorists. The one in Missouri a couple years ago came up with a list, and they sent this to every policeman in Missouri. This kind of concerns me. The people on the list might be me. People on the list from the Fusion Center in Missouri that you need to be worried about, that policemen should stop, are people who have bumper stickers that might be pro-life, who have bumper stickers that might be for more border security, people who support third-party candidates, people who might be in the Constitution Party. Ooh, isn't there some irony there? You might be in the Constitution Party. You believe in the Constitution so much, you might be a terrorist. So I think we need to be concerned about this. Things are not so black and white. If someone's shooting a gun at us, a cannon, a missile, a rocket, a plane, it's pretty easy to know what lethal attacks are and to repel them, and that there should be no due process. But we're talking about people in their home. We're talking about people in a restaurant or a cafe that someone is making an accusation. If the accusation is based on how many fingers you have on your hand, I've got a problem with that standard. If the standard to be used for killing Americans is whether you pay in cash, I've got a problem with that. If the standard to be used in America is being close to someone who is bad or the government thinks is bad is enough for you to be killed, and not even to count you as an accidental kill, to count you as a combatant because you were near them. See, here's the problem, and this is no passing problem. This is an important problem. There was a man named Al-Awlaki. He was a bad guy. By all evidence available to the public that I've read, he was treasonous. I have no sympathy for his death. I still would have tried him in a federal court for treason, and I think he could have been executed. But his son was 16 years old, had missed his dad, gone for 2 years. His son sneaks out of the house and goes to Yemen. His son is then killed by a drone strike. Now, they won't tell us if he was targeted. I suspect, since there were other people in the group, there was about 20 people killed, that they were targeting someone else. I don't know that. I don't have inside information on that, but I suspect that. But here's the real problem. When the president's spokesman was asked about Al-Awlaki's son, do you know what his response was? This I find particularly callous and particularly troubling. The president's response to the killing of Al-Awlaki's son, he said he should have chosen a more responsible father. Well, you know, it's kind of hard to choose who your parents are. That's sort of like saying to someone whose father is a thief or a murderer or rapist, which is obviously a bad thing, but does that mean it's okay to kill their children? Think of the standard we would have. If our standard for killing people overseas is you should have chose a more responsible parent, it just boggles the mind and really affects me to think about that would be our standard. There's absolutely no excuse for the president not to come forward on this. I've been asking for a month for an answer. It's like pulling teeth to get any answer from the president. Why is that? Because he doesn't want to answer the question the way he should as a good and moral and upstanding and someone who believes in the Constitution should, that absolutely no American should ever be killed in America who's sitting in a cafe. No American should ever be killed in their house without a warrant and some kind of aggressive behavior by them, to be bombed in your sleep. There's nothing American about that. There's nothing constitutional about that. But he says trust him. He says he hasn't done it yet. He says he doesn't intend to do so, but he might. Mr. President, that's just not good enough. That's not enough. It's not enough for me to be placated. It's not enough for me to be quiet. So I've come here today to speak for as long as I can. I won't be able to speak forever, but I'm going to speak as long as I can to draw attention to something that I find really to be very disturbing. People have asked about this nomination process because I've actually voted for a couple of the president's nominees, some of whom I've objected to, some of whom I've had personal differences as well as political differences. This is not about partisanship. I voted for the Secretary of State, John Kerry. I have almost nothing in common with him politically. I've disagreed with him repeatedly on the floor, but I gave the President the prerogative of choosing his Secretary of State because I think the president won the election. He deserves to get to make some choices on who's in his cabinet. I voted for the very controversial Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel. There were things I liked about him, things I disliked about him. I filibustered him twice before I voted to let him go forward. And people have given me a hard time. Conservatives from my party have blasted me for doing that. But I gave the president that prerogative. So I'm not standing down here as a Republican who will never vote for a Democrat. I voted for the first three nominees by the president. This is not about partisanship. I have allowed the president to pick his political appointees, but I will not sit quietly and let him shred the Constitution. I cannot sit at my desk quietly and let the president say that he will kill Americans on American soil who are not actively attacking a country. I mean, the answer should be so easy. I can't imagine that he will not expressly come forward and say, no, I will not kill Americans on American soil. The Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be held for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on the presentment or indictment of a grand jury. It goes on to say that no person will be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Now, some hear due process, and if you're not a lawyer, I'm not a lawyer, when you first hear it, you think, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to have due process? What it means is you're protected. You get protections. Is our justice system perfect? No. Sometimes you go all the way through due process in our country, and we've actually convicted people who are innocent. Fortunately, it's very rare, but think about that. We've actually convicted people who are innocent. What are the chances that the president, going through a PowerPoint slideshow and flashcards, might make a mistake on innocent or guilt? I would say there is a chance. Even our judicial system that goes through all of these processes, with judge reviewing the indictment, with a jury reviewing it, and then with a sentencing phase, with all of that going forward, we sometimes make mistakes. What are the chances that one man, one politician, no matter what party they're from, could make a mistake on this? I think there's a real chance that that exists. That's why we put these rules in place. Patrick Henry wrote that the Constitution wasn't given or written or put down to restrain you. The Constitution was to restrain us. There's always been, since the beginning of time, since we first had government, this desire to restrain the government, to try to keep the government from going too strong, to try to keep the government from taking your rights. It's interesting when you look at the Constitution gave what are called enumerated powers to government, and Madison said that these enumerated powers were few and defined. The liberties you were given, though, are numerous and unlimited. So there's about 17 powers given to government, which we've now transformed into about a gazillion, or at least a million new powers. We don't pay much attention to the enumerated powers or to the Constitution anymore. But the Constitution left your rights. They left your rights as unenumerated. They aren't limited. Your rights are limitless. So when we get to the 9th and 10th Amendment, it says specifically that those rights not granted to your government are left to the states and the people respectively. It didn't list what those rights are. The 14th Amendment talks about privileges and immunities are left to you also. They're to be protected. But I don't think there's a person in America. That's why I can't understand the president's unwillingness to say he's not going to kill non-combatants. Think about that. He's unwilling to say publicly that he's not going to kill non-combatants. Because that's what we're talking about here. I'm not talking about someone with a bazooka or a grenade launcher on their shoulder. Anyone committing lethal force can be repelled with lethal force. No one argues that point. I'm talking about whether you can kill non-combatants. Because many of the people being killed overseas are non-combatants. Are they potential combatants? Maybe. Will maybe the standard can be less overseas than it is here for people involved in a battle, but it's getting kind of murky overseas as well. But for goodness sakes, in America, we can't just sort of have this idea that we're going to kill non-combatants. We're talking about people eating in a cafe, at home, in a restaurant. I think we need to be a little more careful. The power that was given by the Constitution to the Senate was that of advise and consent. This constitutional provision provides us with the power to consent to nominations or withhold consent. It's a check on the executive branch, but it only works if we actually use it. I'm here today to speak for as long as I can hold up to try to rally support from people from both sides to say, for goodness sakes, why don't we use some advice and consent? Why don't we advise the President that he should come forward and say he will not condone, nor does he believe he has the authority to kill non-combatants? As a check on the executive branch, this power that's granted to the Senate is the right to withhold consent. The Constitution doesn't provide senators with the specifics or the criteria of why we withhold consent. That's left to us to decide. I withhold my consent today because I'm deeply concerned that the executive branch has not provided an answer, that the President refuses to say that he won't kill non-combatants. The President swore an oath to the Constitution. He said he will protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution. He didn't say, I intend to when it's convenient. He said, I will defend the Constitution, and it's inexcusable for him not to come forward. There's an author that writes for The Atlantic who's written a lot about the drone program by the name of Conor Friedersdorf. He recounts the tale of Al-Awlaki's son who was killed, and he said when the President's spokesman was asked about the strike that killed him, the President's spokesman replied, well, he'd have been fine if he'd had a more responsible father. If that's our standard, we've sunk to a real low. Cornered by reporters after this, White House Secretary Robert Gibbs attempted to defend the kill list, which is secret, of course. You have to remember, if we're going to kill non-combatants in America, or people we think might someday be combatants, the list will be secret. So you won't get a chance to protest, hey, I'm not that bad. I might have said that one time, but I'm not that bad. All right? I've objected to big government, not all government. I'm not fomenting revolution. I was critical at that meeting. I was at a Tea Party meeting and I was critical of the President. But I'm not a revolutionary. Please don't kill me. Should we live in a country where you have to be worried about what you say? Should we live in a country where you have to worry about what you write? What kind of country would that be? Why is there not more moral outrage? Why is there not every senator coming down to say, you're exactly right, let's go ahead and hold this nomination, and why don't we hold it till we get more clarification from the President? Conor Friedersdorf of The Atlantic writes that it's vital for the uninitiated to understand how Team Obama misleads when it talks about the drone program. Ask how their kill list can be justified. Gibbs, the President's spokesman, replies, when there are people who are trying to harm us and have pledged to bring terror to these shores, we have taken the fight to them. But since the kill list itself is secret, there's no way to offer a specific counterexample. It's one thing to say, yeah, these people are going to probably come and attack us, which, to tell you the truth, is probably not always true. There are people fighting a civil war in Yemen who probably have no conception of ever coming to America. Friedersdorf goes on to say, but we do know that U.S. drones are targeting people who've never pledged to carry out attacks in the United States. So we're talking about non-combatants who have never pledged to carry out attacks or being attacked overseas. Think about it, if that's going to be the standard at home, people who have never really, truly been involved with combat against us. Take Pakistan, where the CIA kills some people without even knowing their identities. This is more from Friedersdorf. As Obama nears the end of his term, Officials said the kill list in Pakistan has slipped to fewer than 10 al-Qaeda targets, down from as many as 24, and yet we're killing hundreds of people in Pakistan. There's a quote that I think sort of brings this and makes this very poignant. There's a quote from an ex-CIA agent, I think it's Bruce Radel, who says, "The drone strike program is sort of like a lawnmower. You can keep mowing them down, but as soon as the lawnmower stops, the grass grows again." Some people have gone one step further and said, for every one you kill, or for every one you accidentally kill that you didn't intend to kill, 10 more spring up. Think about it. If it were your family member and they've been killed and they were innocent, or you believe them to be innocent, it's going to make you more or less likely to become involved with attacking the United States. I've written a couple letters to John Brennan, who's been put up for the CIA nomination. I think it looks like the first letter was sent January 25th. So here we are into March, and I only got a response when he was threatened. So here's a guy who the president promotes as being transparent and wanting to give a lot of information to the American people. He won't respond to a U.S. senator. How do they treat the U.S. Senate with disdain, basically? Won't even respond to us, much less the American people, when I asked him these questions. He finally responded only when his nomination was threatened. So when it came to the committee and it appeared as if I had bipartisan support for slowing down his nomination if he didn't answer his questions, then he answered his questions. It doesn't give me a lot of confidence that in the future, going forward, if he is approved, he's going to be real forthcoming and real transparent about this. I don't have a lot of anticipation or belief that we're going to get more information after this nomination hearing. Some are now saying, you know, you've gotten your pound of flesh, let him go, and we'll keep working on this. The problem is once he's gone, the discussion's over. Others in my party have been trying to get information about what went horribly wrong in Benghazi and have gotten some of that information, but only by using it as leverage to try to get the president to do what is the honorable thing, and that is to be more transparent with his ways. In the first letter that I sent to Brennan, I asked him the question, is it legal to order the killing of American citizens and that you would not be compelled to even give your reasoning, not even specific to the case, but any of your reasoning? So finally, as these questions came forward, some of the things were leaked out. One of the most troubling things that came out is when Brennan and the president finally began to talk about the drone strike program, which according to the former press secretary, they were to deny that it existed for years. When they finally came out, they told us a couple of things about their interpretation of it. One, that they have no geographic limit to their drone strikes. The second thing is they told us what they thought was imminent. And this is pretty important because a lot of Americans, myself included, believe that if we're being attacked, you can respond with lethal force. But a lot of Americans think that you have to actually be engaged in that to respond with lethal force. But they told us that the way their lawyers interpret imminent is imminent doesn't have to mean immediate. Well, only a bunch of lawyers could get together, government lawyers get together and say that imminent is not immediate. And you have to understand, and what we should be asking the president is this your standard for America? If you are going to assert that you have the right to kill Americans on American soil, are you going to assert that your standard is that an imminent threat doesn't have to be immediate? I'm quite concerned when I hear this kind of evasiveness, this sort of non-response to questions. We also asked, would it not be appropriate to require a judge or a court to review this? See, here's the real interesting thing. We had a president who ran for office saying your phone shouldn't be tapped without a warrant. I happen to agree with the candidate Obama. But what happened to candidate Obama, who wanted to protect your right to privacy to your phone, who doesn't care much about your right not to be killed by a drone without any kind of judicial proceeding? I think we should demand it. The way things work around here, though, is people kind of say, yes, we'll demand it, and maybe later on this year we'll talk about a bill or talk about getting something. What they should do is just say no more. We're not going to move forward until we get some justice. We're not going to let the president, any president, Republican or Democrat, do this. One of the other questions I asked the president was, it is paradoxical that the federal government would need to go before a judge to authorize a wiretap on U.S. citizens, even overseas, but possibly not have any kind of oversight of killing an American here in America. We've asked him how many citizens have been killed. We haven't gotten an answer to that. They say not many, and hopefully it hasn't been many. But I think it's important to know. I think it would be important to know if we're going to target Americans in America, if that list exists. I think it would be important to know if being close to someone is also justified. You know, just because what if you just happen to live in the neighborhood of somebody who's a suspected terrorist? Is it okay because you were close to them? What if you happen to go to dinner with a guy you didn't know or a woman you didn't know and the government says they're a terrorist? Just because you're having dinner with them and you're of a male between the ages of 16 and 50, does that make you a combatant? We also asked the question, do you condone the CIA's practice of counting civilians killed by U.S. drone strikes as militants simply because they were of the same age? Like every other question, no answer. We asked him whether al-Awlaki's son was a target. No answer. We asked how many people have been targeted. No answer. Part of the problem with this is that we are, or Congress in general, is sloppy about writing legislation in general. I'll give you an example. When Obamacare legislation was written, it's over 2,000 pages, but it leaves up to the Secretary of Health, I think 1,800 times the power to decide at a later date what the law or the rule would be. So since Obamacare of 2,000 pages has been written, there have been now 9,000 pages of regulations. Dodd-Frank's kind of the same way. Dodd-Frank was a couple thousand pages. It's now going to wind up with 8,000 or 9,000 pages of regulations. We abdicate our responsibility by not really writing legislation. We write shells of legislation that are imprecise and don't retain the power, and because of that, the executive branch and the bureaucracy, which is essentially the same thing, do whatever they want. This happened also with the use of authorization of force in Afghanistan. This happened, over 10 years ago now, 12 years ago. I thought we were going to war against the people who attacked us, and I'm all for that. I would have voted for the war. I would have preferred it to have been a declaration of war. I think we were united in saying, let's get those people who attacked us on 9/11 and make sure it never happens again. The problem is as this war has drug on, they take that authorization of use of force to mean pretty much anything. And so they have now said that the war has no geographic limitations, so it's really not a war in Afghanistan. It's a war in Yemen, Somalia, Mali. It's a war in unlimited places. Were we a body that cared about our prerogative to declare war, we would take that power back. But I'll tell you how poor, and this is on both sides of the aisle, how poor is our understanding or belief in retaining that power here. About a year ago, I tried to end the Iraq War. You may say, well, I thought the Iraq War was already over. It is, but we still have an authorization of use of force that says we can go to war in Iraq anytime. And since they think the use of force in Afghanistan means limitless war anywhere, anytime in the whole world, for goodness sakes, wouldn't we try to take back a declaration of war and authorization of force if the war is over? But here's the sad part. I actually got a vote on it, and I think I got less than 20 votes. You can't end a war after it's over up here. And it has repercussions because these authorizations to use force are used for many other things. So the authorization of force says you can go after al-Qaeda or associated terrorists. The problem is that when you allow the executive branch to sort of determine what is al-Qaeda, you've got no idea. For the most part, I will not be able to determine that either. All the information is classified, and there are a lot of bad people. There's a war going on in Yemen, and I don't know how much it has to do with us, you know, or how much that there's an al-Qaeda presence there trying to organize to come and attack us. Maybe there is, but maybe there's also people who are just fighting their local government. How about Mali? I'm not sure that in Mali they're probably worried more about trying to get the next day's food than coming over here to attack us. But we have to ask these questions, and we have to ask about limitations on force, because essentially what we have now is a war without geographic boundaries, and we have many on my side who come down here and they say, oh, the battlefield's here in America. Be worried. Be alarmed. Alarm bells should go off when people tell you that the battlefield's in America. Why? Because when the battlefield's in America, we don't have due process. What they're talking about is they want the laws of war. Another way of putting that, they call it the laws of war. Another way to put it is called it martial law. That's what they want in the United States when they say the battlefield is here. One of them, in fact, said, if they ask for a lawyer, you tell them to shut up. Well, if that's the standard we're going to have in America, I'm quite concerned that the battlefield would be here and that the Constitution wouldn't apply. Because to tell you the truth, if you are shooting at us in Afghanistan, the Constitution doesn't apply over there. But I certainly want it to apply here. If you're engaged in combat overseas, you don't get due process. But when people say, oh, the battlefields come to America and the battlefields everywhere, the war is limitless in time and scope, be worried, because your rights will not exist if you call America a battlefield for all time. We've asked him whether the strikes are exclusively focused on al-Qaeda, and what is the definition of being part of al-Qaeda. In 1947, the National Security Act was passed, and it said the CIA doesn't operate in America. Most people, most lay people know that. The CIA is supposed to be doing surveillance and otherwise outside the U.S. of foreign threats. The FBI works within the United States. They do some of the same thing, but they're different groups. CIA operating in Iraq or Afghanistan doesn't get a warrant before they do whatever they do to snoop on our enemies. The FBI in our country does. They operate under different rules and for a reason. So we don't want them to operate in the United States. It's not we're saying the CIA are bad people. We just don't want them operating with no rules or with the rules that we allow them to operate overseas. We don't want them operating in our country. The disappointing thing is that a month ago when I asked John Brennan this question, as his nomination came forward, he said I couldn't get an answer. He would not answer the question about the CIA operating in the United States. Only after yanking his chain, browbeating him in committee, threatening not to let him out of committee, does he finally say he's going to obey the law. We should be alarmed by that. Alarm bells should go off when we find that what is going on here is it takes that much for him to say that he's going to obey the law. Now, the President has said, don't worry, because he's not going to kill you with a drone unless it's infeasible to catch you. Now, sounds kind of comforting, but I guess if our standard for whether we kill you or not is whether it's practical or not, that does bother me a little bit. It just doesn't sound quite strict enough, because I'm kind of worried that, you know, maybe there's a sequester and the President says we can't have tours of the White House. Maybe he's not got enough people to go arrest you. He had policemen behind him. He said he was going to lay off the policemen. Of course, he doesn't have anything to do with the policemen, so don't worry about that. But he had the policemen behind him. He's going to lay off. So maybe it's infeasible because he's laid off the policemen, so it's going to be easier to kill you. So, you know, I know that sounds like we've gone a slippery slope beyond what he's asking for. But if the standard is it's infeasible to capture you and that's what you're hanging your hat on, I'd be a little concerned that that may not be enough protection for Americans on American soil. Now, there is a law called Posse Comitatus. It's been on the books since shortly after the Civil War. And it's once again one of these things a lot of people don't think about, but it's an important thing. It says the military doesn't operate on U.S. soil unless there's a declaration of an insurrection or a civil war. There has to be a process that Congress goes through. And we've had this law for a long time. And once again, the reason we do it is not because we think our military are bad people. I'm proud of our soldiers. I'm proud of our Army. I'm proud of what they do for our country. But they operate under different rules. And it's a much more dangerous environment they operate under, and it's different. It's still dangerous in America, but policemen have a different rules of engagement than your soldiers have. And there's more restrictions and restraint on what we do in our country. So that's why we say the military can't operate here. So when we ask the President, can you kill Americans on American soil with your drone strikes, which is part of the military, it should be an easy answer. In fact, I hope someone's calling him now and asking him for an answer. It saved me a lot of time and breath, and my throat's already dry, and I just got started. But if they would ask him for an answer, can the military operate in the United States? Well, no. The law says the military can't operate in the United States. It's on the books, and he should simply do the honorable thing and say he will obey the law. It's simple. But I don't get why they refuse to answer it. It worries me that they refuse to answer the question, because by refusing to answer it, I believe that they believe they have expansive power, unlimited power. The real irony of this is that many on the left, Senator Barack Obama included, were very critical of the Bush administration. They felt like the Bush administration usurped power. They felt like the Bush administration argued invalid aggrandizement or grasping for power. John Yoo was one of the architects of this, believing in basically if the president just says, hey, I'm going to protect you, I can do whatever the hell I want. Many on the left objected to that. Some of us on the right also objected to this usurpation of power by the Republican president. But the thing is now the shoe's on the other foot, and we're not seeing any of that. We're all of a sudden now seeing a president who is worried about wiretaps, not at all worried about the legality of killing Americans on American soil with no judicial process. But the law Posse Comitatus prevents this from happening. It's very clear. It's been on the books 150 some odd years. I would think it would be pretty easy for the president to go ahead and say he will obey the law. We asked Brennan the question on this, and we got no answer. The answers that we've gotten are almost more disturbing than getting an answer, really, to tell you the truth. Because when the president responds that I haven't killed any Americans yet at home, and that I don't intend to do so, but I might, it's incredibly alarming and really goes against his oath of office. He says in his oath of office that I will preserve, I will protect, and I will defend the Constitution. It doesn't say I intend to or that I might. Can you imagine the furor if people were talking about the Second Amendment? Can you imagine what conservatives would say if a president said, well, yeah, I kind of like the Second Amendment, and I intend to, when convenient, when it's feasible, to protect the Second Amendment? Or what about those who believe in the First Amendment? If the president were to say, I haven't broken the First Amendment yet, I intend to follow it, but I might break it. Or I intend to follow it when it's feasible. So I have all these rules, and that's what the president answered. When he was at Google campus a couple of weeks ago, they asked him the question, can you kill Americans on American soil? And he said, well, the rules will probably be different outside the U.S. than inside. Which basically means, yes, he thinks he can kill Americans on American soil, but he's going to have some rules. Don't worry about it, because he will make some rules and there will be a process, but it won't be due process. It'll be a process that he sets up in secret in the White House, and I don't find that acceptable. The only answer really acceptable, you know, we ask a question that could be yes or no. Can you kill an American on American soil? It's a yes or no question. They've been very evasive, and they have never really answered the question. But when we ask it, we pretty much knew only one answer was acceptable, and that answer is no. I mean, and if you don't answer it, basically, by not answering it, you're saying yes. I was actually a little bit startled when I finally got the answer, yes, we can kill Americans on American soil. I thought for sure that they would just be evasive to the end and try to get their nominee through without opening Pandora's box. But they have opened Pandora's box, and it would be a mistake for us to ignore it. It would be a mistake for us to ignore the ramifications of what they've done. When we separate out police power from judicial power, it's an important separation. You know, the police can arrest you. They're allowed to do certain things. But the policeman that comes to your door and puts handcuffs on you doesn't decide your guilt. Now, sometimes we don't always think about how important this separation is, but it's incredibly important that those who arrest you they're not even really the ones who ultimately accuse you. The court, through the people, accuse you, and then you're given a trial to determine your guilt. And it's complicated. It isn't always clear who's innocent and who's guilty. Judges and juries make mistakes, but at least we have a process. You get appeals most of the time. So we have a significant process going on that has a several hundred-year tradition at the least. So what really gets me about the process that the President favors is it's the trust me process. You know, I have no intention of doing bad things. I will do good things. I'm a good person. And I'm not really disputing his motives or not saying he isn't a good person, but I'm disputing someone who's naive enough to think that that's good enough for our republic, that his good intentions are good enough for our republic. It never would have been accepted. It would have been laughed out of the Constitutional Convention. The Founding Fathers would have objected so strenuously that that person probably would never have been elected to office in our country. Someone who doesn't believe that the rules have to be in place and that we can't have our rights guaranteed by the intentions of our politicians. Think about it. Congress has about a 10% approval rating. Think the American people want to base whether they're going to be killed by a drone on a politician? I certainly don't. Doesn't have anything to do with whether he's a Republican or a Democrat. I would be here today if this were a Republican president, because you can't give that much power to one person. We separated the police power from the adjudication or from the jury power, from the decisions on innocence and guilt, is separate from the police power, purposefully so and with great forethought. Some transform this, and the President's tried, Brennan has tried to transform this into, oh, well, we need to reserve this power for when planes are attacking the Twin Towers. Well, that's not what we're talking about, Mr. President, and I think you misunderstand, or you purposely misunderstand, or you purposely obfuscate, or you purposely mislead. No one is questioning whether the U.S. can repel an attack. No one is questioning whether your local police can repel an attack. Anybody involved in lethal force, the legal doctrine in our country, and been historically, has always been that the government can repel lethal attacks. The problem is that the drone strike program is often not about combatants. It is about people who may or may not be conspiring, but they're not in combat. They're in a car, they're in their house, they're in a restaurant, they're in a cafe. If we're going to bring that standard to America, what I'm doing down here today is asking the President to be explicit. If you're going to have the standard that you're going to kill non-combatants in America, come forward and please say it clearly so we know what we're up against. If you're not going to do it, come up with the easy answer is, I'm not going to kill non-combatants. That would have been easy for him to say. And he could have said, well, the military at some point in time, has to repel invasions. We know that, Mr. President. We're not questioning that. But we are questioning a drone strike program that, we don't know because nobody will tell us the numbers. The numbers are secret. One senator said in a public meeting the other day 4,700 people have been killed overseas, if I had to venture a guess, a significant amount of them weren't involved in shooting at American soldiers. But if they were, by all means, kill them. If we're fighting a war in Afghanistan, which we have been, and if there are soldiers around the bend that are a threat to our soldiers, there is no due process at that point. But that's not what we're arguing about. We're arguing about targeted strikes of people not involved in combat. That's my concern. My concern also is that who is and what is a terrorist? Who is associated with terrorism? Because the government's put out many documents now that tell you to see something, say something. But the stuff you see, you know, I'm not so sure that these people are terrorists. If you see somebody paying in cash, or if you have a store, one of your customers comes in frequently and they pay in cash, should you report them to the government? I can't imagine that that's the kind of standard that we're going to have in our country for deciding drone strikes. When it comes to some of these people, though, I think some of the drone strikes have probably been justified. Al-Awlaki, I think, was a traitor. This is not from looking at classified documents. This is just from reading the lay press. By all means, he gave up on his country, renounced his citizenship, went overseas, consorted, and aided the enemy. But one of the interesting questions about aiding the enemy is what exactly that means and what are the standards to be. Kevin Williamson writes for the National Review, and he wrote an article on drones that I think really brings this home. If you're going to talk about and want to know who are the people who could potentially be killed. Because in some ways, Al-Awlaki was a sympathizer, someone who aided and abetted by internet talk and chatter. That was the main thing he was accused of, actually. After the fact, they said he had more direct association. I don't know if that's true or not and haven't seen the secret information on that. But what I would say is that he was initially brought up as a sympathizer. And here's the problem. Many writers have said if you take up arms against your country, you're an enemy combatant. Well, I think that's true. If you're in Afghanistan, you got a grenade launcher on your shoulder and you're shooting at Americans, you are an enemy combatant. You don't get due process. But here's the question. If you're in Poughkeepsie and you're on the internet and you say, I sympathize with, you know, some group around the world that doesn't like America, and you say bad things about America, are you a traitor? I mean, you can try someone for treason for that. I'm not sure if it'll rise up to that if you're politically opposed to what your government is doing and in favor of another. But Kevin Williamson gets it pretty clearly. He says, if sympathizing with our enemies and propagandizing on their behalf is equivalent to making war on our country, then the Johnson and Nixon administrations should have bombed every elite college in America. Because during the 1960s, that's all that came out was anti-America, anti-war. Is objecting to your government or objecting to the policy of your government sympathizing with the enemy? Some openly were sympathetic. No one will ever forget Jane Fonda swiveling around in North Vietnamese armored guns, and it was despicable. That's one thing if you want to try her for treason, but are you going to just drop a drone Hellfire missile on Jane Fonda? Are you going to drop a Hellfire missile on those at Kent State? You know, our country objected to what happened at Kent State, which was, you know, in some ways not, it was not good, but in some ways accidental since they were shooting over the heads of these people. But can you imagine, we've gone from a country who was rightfully upset about the deaths at Kent State to a country that now is going to say that if you're at your college and you're rabble-rousing because you don't like the government's foreign policy or the government's war actions, that you're sympathizing. See, there are a lot of questions that aren't being asked because sympathizing appears to be used as a standard for the drone strike program. We actually had students apparently during the Vietnam War who were actually raising funds for the Viet Cong. That to me does sound like treason. Sounds like something that when we're fighting an enemy and you're raising and giving comfort to the enemy, that does sound like treason. So I have no problems with some people actually being tried for treason. But they would get their day in court. They don't get a Hellfire missile sent to their house. There is, though, a difference between sympathizing and taking up arms. Most people around here who want to justify no rules, America's a battlefield, no limits to war, they really want to blur it all together. Because it's easier to say, oh, you don't want to stop anybody who's shooting at Americans. But it's not true. I think lethal force can be used against those engaged in lethal force. What troubles me about the drone strike program is that quite a few, I don't know the number, the Wall Street Journal says the bulk of the attacks in Pakistan have been signature attacks, meaning nobody named and nobody specifically identified, and that civilians aren't really counted because anybody, any male between the age of 16 and 50 is a combatant unless otherwise proven. But if those are the standards, I think we need to be alarmed. And I think there is a difference between sympathizing and taking up arms. One of the interesting things, and Kevin Williamson in the National Review brings this out, and it's sort of a conundrum for conservatives. Because the thing about saying someone was involved and just taking the government's word, like saying Al Walkie was involved with these other people and taking the government's word, because we have no way of ascertaining or getting and questioning whether secret information is true or not true, is that just a few years before this, a lot of people don't remember this, Al Walkie, who was killed, a couple years before this, Al Walkie was brought to the Pentagon to speak as part of a group of moderate Islamic preachers. They thought him to be an Islamic voice of reason. He even came to the Capitol and said prayers in the Capitol. This is the guy who the government said was a good guy for a while, who later said was a bad guy. And I think ultimately the evidence that he was a bad guy is pretty strong. But most of his crime was sympathizing. And was it enough of a standard? I think in a court, in a treasonous court, I think Al Walkie would have been convicted of treason were I a juror. I would have voted that he was committing treason, and I wouldn't have had trouble at all with a drone strike on him. But if we're going to take by extension the standard we used in putting him on the list, that he was a sympathizer, an agitator, and a pain in the royal you-know-what on the Internet, there's a lot of those people in America. If that's going to be our standard, that's why I would feel a little more comforted if it weren't an accusation by a politician that unleashes Hellfire missiles. I would be a little more comforted, and I think we would all sleep a little better in our house at night if we knew that before the Hellfire missile comes down, a policeman would come to your door and say, we accuse you of this. And they might put handcuffs on you and take you to jail, but they don't get to summarily execute you. That's all I'm asking here. I'm asking for the President to admit publicly that he's not in favor of summary executions. That's really all I'm asking. Summary executions of non-combatants. It seems like a pretty easy answer. We could be done with this in a moment's notice. If someone will call the President, ask him the question, we could be done with this. Because that's what I want to hear. Not that he's not going to use the military to repel an invasion. Nobody's questioning the authority of the President to repel an invasion. But I am questioning the authority of the President to kill non-combatants, asleep at home, eating in the restaurant, or what have you. One of the things that Williamson brings up in this National Review article again, which I also found a little bit, it's a little bit off the subject but somewhat related. You know, we are fearful, and we didn't do a very good job with 9/11, frankly. 9/11 occurred because of a lot of mistakes, and sometimes you can look back as a Monday morning quarterback and say, oh, we should have done this. But one of the things that always sort of bothered me about 9/11 was that no one was ever fired. In fact, they gave medals. The head of the FBI, the head of the CIA, everybody gets a medal. No one was ever fired. Now, some of you may not have remembered this, but there was a 20th hijacker. His name was Moussaoui. He was up in Minnesota, I believe. They capture him a month in advance to 9/11. And when they capture him, the FBI agent there, who was spot on and doing an excellent job, and really the guy who should have gotten the medal, was the FBI agent that caught Moussaoui and was asking his superiors to get a warrant. He asked repeatedly. He sends 70 letters to headquarters saying, can I have a warrant to open this guy's computer, to investigate him? He's turned down. He gets no response. It was a horrible and tragic human error. What do? We promote and give medals to the people who were in charge. That agent should have gotten a medal, but anybody above him who made the decision not to even ask for a warrant shouldn't have gone anywhere within the department. Williamson makes the point. He says if our law enforcement and intelligence agencies, particularly the State Department, had been doing a minimally competent job vis-a-vis visa overstays and application screening, at least 15 of the 19 9/11 hijackers would have been caught. They were all here on student visas. They were all overstaying their student visas. Nobody was paying attention. I still ask that question to today. I ask, do we know where all the students are, particularly from about 10 Middle Eastern countries? The ones that are in our country, do we know where they are? I think we have not a good enough system to know where they all are, whether they've come and gone. And this is a real problem. Had we actually looked at Moussaoui's computer, they did. They looked at it on September 12th, the day after 9/11. They looked at his computer. I think it, within hours, led them and linked them up to several of the hijackers in Florida and ultimately would have perhaps exposed the whole ring. Same thing was going on in Arizona at the same time. They had somebody in Arizona saying there's guys wanting to fly planes that don't want to learn how to land them. There were horrible and tragic occurrences that happened, human breakdown. But how do we fix it? We fix it the same way we fix everything in Washington. We threw a ton of money at it, and I mean a ton of money at it. Billions upon billions into the trillions of dollars have now been spent. But really, the main problem with 9/11 was lack of communication, lack of lack of really doing a good job at what you were already supposed to be doing. When we look at this issue, and as we go forward from here, I think what is most important to me is that we just not let this go. This is the first time that I've decided to come to the floor and speak in a true filibuster. People talk about the filibuster all the time. They say, you know, the filibuster is overused and it's abused. A lot of times the filibuster in our country and in the Senate is actually requesting that 60 votes happen and we have to do everything by unanimous consent. So it almost never happens. I've been here 2 years and I don't think I've seen anybody come to the floor and speak in an open and spoken filibuster as I'm doing today. I think it's important, though, and I think that the issue rises to such an occasion because I think there are very few things, there are a lot of things we disagree on, Republicans and Democrats, and I think there are a lot of things we could actually pass up here, a lot of things that we actually agree to that we could actually pass if we'd get together and try to do smaller bills and work on what we agree and get away from some of the empty partisanship. But the reason I came to the floor today to do this is because I think certain things rise above party politics. Certain things rise above partisanship. And I think your right to be secure in your person, the right to be secure in your liberty, the right to be tried by a jury of your peers, these are things that are so important and rise to such a level that we shouldn't give up on them easily. And I don't see this battle as a partisan battle at all. I don't see this as Republicans versus Democrats. I would be here if there were a Republican president doing this. And really, the great irony of this is that President Obama's position on this is an extension of George Bush's opinion. It basically is a continuation and an expansion of George Bush's opinion. George Bush was a president who believed in a very expansive power, virtually, some would say, unlimited. He was accused of running an imperial presidency. The irony is that this president that we have currently was elected in opposition to that. This president was one elected who, when he was in this body, was often very vocal at saying that the president's powers were limited. When I first came here, one of the first votes that I was able to get was a vote on whether or not we should go to a war without congressional approval. And so the interesting thing is that the war was beginning in Libya. It turned out to be a small war, but small wars sometimes lead to big wars. In fact, that was one of Eisenhower's admonitions, is beware of small wars, that you may find yourself in a big war. Fortunately, the Libya war didn't turn out to be a big war, although I think it's still a huge mess over there. And I think it's still yet to be determined whether Libya will descend into the chaos of radical Islam. I think there's a chance they still may descend into that chaos. But when the question came up about going to war in Libya, there was the question of, well, doesn't the Constitution say that you have to declare war? And so we looked back through some of the president's writings as a candidate. One of the president's writings I found very instructive, and I was quite proud of him for having said it. The president said that no president shall unilaterally go to war without the authority of Congress, unless there's an imminent threat to the country. I guess we should be a little wary of his unless now, since we know imminent doesn't have to be immediate, and imminent really no longer means what humans once thought imminent meant. But he did say that the president doesn't go to war by himself. I think it would be fair to say that candidate Obama also felt that the president didn't have the authority to imprison you indefinitely without a trial. I think it's also safe to say that Barack Obama of 2007 would be right down here with me arguing against this drone strike program if he were in the Senate. It amazes and disappoints me how much he's actually changed from what he once stood for. But I forced a vote on his words. I took his exact words. We quoted them and put them up on a standard next to me, and we voted on a sense of the Senate that said, no president should go to war without the authority of Congress, which basically just restates the Constitution. You would think that would be a pretty easy vote for people. I think I got less than 20 votes. That is the sad state of affairs we're in. Now, some who actually probably believe that refused to vote for it because they said, well, he's a Republican and I won't vote with a Republican. But I honestly tell you, were the shoe on the other foot, were there a Republican president here and I a Republican senator, I'd have exactly the same opinion. My opinion today on drone strikes would be exactly the same opinion under George Bush, and I was critical of George Bush as well. So were there a Republican president now, I would have the same instinct and the same resolution to carry this forward. And on the issue of war, it's the same no matter which president. One of the complaints that you hear a lot of times in the media is about there's no bipartisanship in Congress. Well, the interesting thing is actually there's a lot of bipartisanship in Congress. If you look at people who don't really believe in much restraint of government as far as civil liberties, it really is on both sides. And so you'll find that often these votes on whether or not the Constitution says that we have to declare war in the Congress, Republicans and Democrats vote overwhelmingly against that. And you need to realize the implications of that. What they're voting for is to say we don't retain that power and we don't want it. The Constitution gave it to us, but we're giving it back. And this has been going on for a long time. Really, probably for over 100 years, starting with sort of the Woodrow Wilson sort of grab for presidential power. Presidents have been getting more and more powerful for over 100 years, Republican and Democrat. There was at one point in time in our history a pride among the Senate and a pride among the Congress that said, these are our powers and we're not giving them up. There were people on both sides of the aisle who would stand firm and say, this is not a power I'm willing to relinquish. This is not something that is good for the country. And by relinquishing the power of Congress, we relinquish something very fundamental to our republic, which is the checks and balances. That we should have checks and balances to help and try to prevent one body or one part of the three parts of government from obtaining too much power. And so there was a time when we tried to keep that power. Unfortunately, the bipartisanship that we have now, which many in the media fail to understand, they see us not getting along on taxes and on spending, but they fail to understand that on something very important, on whether or not an individual has a right to a trial by jury, whether an individual has the right to not be detained indefinitely, that there is quite a bit of bipartisanship, usually in the wrong direction. Now, I will say that there is some evolution and some trend towards people being more respectful of this. And there has been some work on both sides of the aisle that has brought some of us who believe in civil liberties together. There was a bill last year called the National Defense Authorization Bill. And in that bill, they said that there was a clause that says that Americans can be indefinitely detained. What does that mean? Well, it means forever, basically, or without a trial, no sort of sentence, no sort of adjudication of guilt or innocence, but an American citizen can be held. And so the question I had, and there was another Republican senator on the floor, I said, boy, does that mean you could actually be sent, an American sent to Guantanamo Bay from here, who's accused of something but never gets a trial? And his answer was yes. His answer was yes, you could send it if they're a danger to the country. The problem with that kind of thinking is that who gets to determine whether you're a danger? Who gets to determine whether you're guilty or innocent? It sort of begs the question of what our court system is set up to do is to try to find guilt or innocence. Guilt or innocence isn't always apparent. And sometimes an accusation is a false accusation. Sometimes accusations are made because people politically don't like your point of view. So the question becomes, should we have a process where we try to determine innocence or guilt? So in the National Defense Authorization Bill, there was an amendment that said that you can be indefinitely detained, an American could be sent to Guantanamo Bay. And we had a big fight over it, and we lost the first time around in 2012. We had an amendment that would have tried to protect American citizens. This was a good example of bipartisanship on our side. We had 45 votes, and I'd say it was probably about 38 Democrats and about 7 Republicans. And so there was an example of both sides kind of working together. We fought and we lost. The next year we came back and we fought for the same amendment again, and we beat them. Interestingly, we beat them. We had 67 votes to say that you cannot detain an American can't be sent to Guantanamo Bay without a trial, without an accusation, without a jury, without the Bill of Rights. You can't do that to Americans. We won the battle with 67 votes. The bill passes. The House passes their version without our amendment on it. It goes to conference committee where they work out the differences, and they stripped out our language. So sometimes when you win around here, you lose. But with the 67, there was a pretty good mix, maybe 35, 40 Democrats and 15, 20 Republicans. So there is some emerging consensus or some kind of emerging group. One of the other senators has called it the checks and balances caucus, and I think that's a very accurate term because that's part of what we're arguing for here. We're arguing that no one person should get too much power, or no one body would get too much power. Some people see all that fighting and disputing between the different branches of government. They see it in a bad light. They say, oh, with all that fighting and bickering, that's gridlock. But in some ways, our founding fathers, I think, weren't too opposed to a little bit of gridlock, particularly if it were gridlock that said, you know what, we're not going to make it easy to get rid of the First Amendment. It's not easy to get a constitutional amendment in our country. We've added some through the years, but it's not easy to do. We make it hard to amend the Constitution. And in fact, we make it such that it really isn't, we're not really a country that's majority rule. And I'm sort of a stickler for talking about the differences between a democracy and a republic. I think some people are sloppy with their words, and they love the idea that America is a democracy. You know, Woodrow Wilson said that we were going to war in the First World War to make the world safe for democracy. Well, number one, we're not a democracy, and we never were intended to be a democracy. When Franklin comes out of the Constitutional Convention, a woman comes up to him and asks him, what will it be? Will it be a monarchy or a democracy? And he says it's a republic. It's a constitutional republic if you can keep it. He was already worried, will democratic action lead to people straying away and giving a government too many powers? But we are a republic. And it's important to know how a difference is between a republic and a democracy, particularly with our history in our country. In our country, we had a period of time where majorities passed some very egregious and unfair and unjust laws. These were called the Jim Crow laws. They passed laws based on your race or the color of your skin, and these were passed by majorities. The important thing about the Constitution and about rights, and one of the reasons I'm here today talking about the Fifth Amendment and how it gives you the right not to be committed to prison or not to be killed without due process, is that our founders thought it was very important. This whole concept between a republic and a democracy, also between or considering the idea that majority state legislatures were voting on something, Jim Crow laws, that would say to a white person you can't sell a house to a black person or vice versa. Those laws were passed by majority rule. So anytime someone comes up to me and says you want a democracy, that's my first question. You're okay with Jim Crow then? Because democracies did bad things. But if you believe that rights are protected and that rights should be protected and that these individual rights are not something that a democracy can overturn, then you do truly believe in a protection that is more important than any democratic rule. There's been some dispute over this. There's a Supreme Court case by the name of Lochner back in 1905. The president doesn't like Lochner at all. He's very much opposed to it. But the one thing about Lochner that I like is that Lochner really expands the 14th Amendment. You know, the 13th, 14th, and 15th were passed after the Civil War, and usually over Democrat objection. In my state, the Democrats ruled the state legislature in Kentucky for many, many years, and they voted against the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The great champions of emancipation, of voting rights, of all of the post-war amendments were the Republicans. Every African American in the country was a Republican before 1930, virtually every African American. In 1931 in Louisville, there were 25,730 black Republicans. There were 129 black Democrats. Every African American was a Republican at one point in time. I try to tell people, even though the numbers have unfortunately reversed, that we are the party that believes in the immutability of rights. We don't believe that the democracy can take away your rights, that a majority rule can take away your First Amendment, your Second Amendment, your Fourth Amendment. And I think if we got that message out, we might change some of what goes on. But the president is an opponent of the Lochner decision. And in the Lochner decision, a state legislature decides something. And it's not really of importance what the decision is so much as that it's about judicial deference, about whether the court should say, well, the state legislature decided this and majorities should get to rule. So many, like Oliver Wendell Holmes, was a dissent in the Lochner case, and he basically said majorities should get to rule. Herbert Crowley, who was one of the founders of the New Republic, he wrote that we can get trapped up in all this support for the Bill of Rights and all these ancient individual rights. If we get too carried away with that, this whole idea of rights thing, we'll have a monarchy of the law instead of a monarchy of the people. Well, it was for good reason that we established a republic and not a democracy. One of the best contrasts, I think, and it may not be a perfect contrast, but I think it has some truth to it and some validity, is that our revolution worked. But our revolution, we established a constrained government. In France, the mob came into power. They had mob rule. The French Revolution was a disaster. And we had some things going for us. You know, we had a colonial government with English common law and English adjudication, and we'd adopted English practices. We were Englishmen, and we believed in the rights of Englishmen. We had that for several hundred years in our country, so it was easier for us to have a revolution, and they didn't quite have that going on in France, and so it was different. But one of the differences I see between the American and the French is we established a republic. And we weren't going to have any majority rule where the majority were, you know, setting up a guillotine. Now, ours wasn't perfect, obviously. The founders left and allowed slavery to still occur. Interestingly, though, if you read the Constitution, I think they were embarrassed by it. You know, the word slave doesn't occur in our Constitution. And in fact, there were many writers, many abolitionist writers. There was a writer by the name of Lysander Spooner, who was an abolitionist, and he actually wrote about the unconstitutionality of slavery before the war. And really, if you read the Constitution and you leave out or acknowledge that there is no word in there slavery and nothing that really says you have to be consigned to slavery, there are things in there that say you can't be kept without being presented with charges. Habeas corpus means present the body. In the old days in England and in different monarchies, they'd just snatch you up. If you were next in line to be king or they made you mad, they snatched you up and put you in the tower. And so they came up with the right of habeas corpus. You had to present the body. You had to say, he's been arrested, and these are the charges against him. We kind of have gotten, you know, to where there's some concern in our country about that, but we had that right all along. So Lysander Spooner wrote and said, well, you know, why shouldn't a slave come forward and say, this guy's keeping me, he's telling me that I have to work for him, but I haven't been charged with anything. What is my crime? Eventually, one court case did come forward, and it was ruled incorrectly. And I'm not sure exactly how the arguments were, but in Dred Scott, they rule you can't make the argument. But I don't know if habeas corpus was part of that case or not, but it should have been. What I'm trying to say, though, is that the rights of the Constitution, the rights of the individual that were enshrined in the Constitution, are important things that democracies can't overturn. So when you get to the Lochner case, the Lochner case is in 1905. The majority rules 5-4 that the right to make a contract is part of your due process. Someone can't deprive you of determining how long your working hours are without due process. So President Obama is a big opponent to this, but I would ask him, among the other things I'm asking him today, to rethink the Lochner case. Because the Lochner case really is what precedes and what the case Buchanan v. Worley is predicated upon. In Buchanan v. Worley is a case in 1917. Interestingly, it comes from my state, from Louisville, Kentucky. There's a young African-American attorney by the name of William Worley. He's a Republican, like most African-Americans were in Louisville in those days. He was a founder of the NAACP. And like most founders of the NAACP, a Republican. And so what they do in 1914 is they sue because the Kentucky legislature, by majority rule, by democratic action, passes a law saying a white person can't sell to a black person in a white section of town or vice versa. So this is the first case the NAACP brings up. Moorfield Story was the famous, I think he was the first president of NAACP, famous attorney. Him and an attorney by the name of, I think it's Clinton Blanky. But they go forward with this case, and they win the case. It actually passes overwhelmingly, but interestingly, this case to end Jim Crow is based on the Lochner decision. So those who don't like the Lochner decision, I'd say go back. We need to reassess Lochner. In fact, there's a good book by Bernstein from George Mason talking about rehabilitating Lochner. The thing is that with majority rule, if you say we're going to give deference to majority rule, or we're going to have judicial restraint, and we're going to say, well, whatever the majority wants is fine, you set yourself up for a diminishment of rights. I go back to the discussion of the Constitution limits power that is given to Congress, but it doesn't limit rights. The powers are enumerated, your rights are unenumerated. The powers given to the government are few and defined. The freedoms left to you are many and undefined. And that's important. And what does this have to do with Lochner? The case in Lochner is whether a majority rule, a state legislature, can take away your due process to contract. Can they take away your life and liberty without due process? And the court rules no. I think it's a wonderful decision. It expands the 14th Amendment and says to the people that you have unenumerated rights. Now, there's some dissension on how we look at these cases, but when you go forward to Buchanan v. Worley, the case about Jim Crow laws and housing segregation, one of the people who was going to dissent, and I think he thought better of it when he thought about he would be the first justice in probably 70-some-odd years to say that he believed in the Jim Crow laws and was upholding Jim Crow laws, was Oliver Wendell Holmes. He actually writes an opinion that has been found but was never presented to the court, and he ended up voting to get rid of the Jim Crow laws. But the interesting thing is he actually wrote an opinion in favor because he believed so strongly in majority rule. I don't think these questions, some may think these are idle questions. I don't think it's an idle question whether or not you have a democracy or a republic. I think that these questions from Lochner, from Buchanan v. Worley, all the way through to the present are important. Last year, or in the last couple of years, we had two cases on gun rights, the Second Amendment. These are called Heller and McDonald. Both of them, I think, can be seen as, once again, an expansion of the 14th Amendment to say your privileges and immunities, which are part of the 14th Amendment, include the Second Amendment, and they include certain rights. In fact, I think any power or any right not given up to the government or limited by the enumerated powers is yours. So when they say the privileges and immunities of the 14th Amendment, I believe that means everything else. What does that mean? It means I believe in a very circumscribed view for government. Now, one of the side benefits of having a circumscribed view of the government would be a government that's not allowed to do much wouldn't get in many problems. For example, if your government wasn't allowed to spend money that it didn't have, or if your government wasn't allowed to spend money on programs that were not enumerated as being within the purview of the federal government, you wouldn't have these massive deficits. We'd have never gotten in this fix if we believed in a republic and not a democracy. Now, what proof do I have that the current officials believe in democracy versus republic? When Obamacare came forward, you know, the comments from the then Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, were a majority passed this, you know. We passed this by a majority. It's a law. Why would anybody question the constitutionality? The President said the same thing. The President said, well, a majority passed this. What right has the court to overturn this? The question has been written about by many, I think, brilliant scholars who have looked at the Constitution and looked at what it means. Some of this has to do with whether or not you presume liberty. Randy Barnett's written about this, Restoring the Constitution, whether you have a presumption of liberty or whether you have a presumption of constitutionality. Now, that may sound a little esoteric. What does that mean? It's whether or not when they pass a law up here, you just presume it's fine because it's a law, and the judges should give deference to it because it was a law. Some of this is kind of confusing because you think, oh, I'm arguing for judicial activism. In a way, I kind of am. Because if the Congress usurps the Constitution, if the Congress takes away from your rights, the judges should stop them in their tracks. I'm not arguing for deference to the legislature. I'm arguing for deference to the Constitution. And so I'm also arguing that there is a presumption of liberty. This goes back to the way we want to look at the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment says that we have unenumerated rights. It says that basically, you know, or I guess by extension, when you go from the 14th Amendment to the 9th and 10th Amendment is the best way to look at this. The 14th Amendment talks about privileges and immunities, and then when you look at what the 9th and 10th Amendment do, they say, you know, those powers not given to government, those freedoms you didn't relinquish, or those powers you didn't give to the government are left to the states and the people respectively. And it says they're not to be disparaged. I've always loved the way that was worded, not to be disparaged. Not only is the federal government not to trample on your rights, they are not to be disparaged. But these rights are unlimited. They're yours. You got them from your Creator. These are natural-born rights, and no democracy should be able to take these away from you. Now, by changing the Constitution, they could literally take away your freedom of speech or your freedom to practice your religion. I don't think I see that ever happening. And it's difficult to change our Constitution, but incredibly important that your Founding Fathers put it in there and made it difficult. Now, I always kind of joke that if you go to a conservative meeting and you talk about the Second Amendment, everybody pats you on the back and they all love you until you get to the Fourth Amendment. But if we're going to have the Second Amendment, I think you've got to have the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free in your person from unreasonable searches and seizures, that a judge should have to have a warrant to come in your house. I always say, how are your guns going to be protected if they can come in your house without a warrant? You've got to have the Fourth Amendment. But you also have to have the Fifth Amendment. You know, we don't talk about the Fifth Amendment very much. Everything's about the Second Amendment. It's been all over the news. You can't turn on a channel without talking about the Second Amendment. But I think today's as good a day as any to talk about the Fifth Amendment. I've come here to filibuster the nomination of John Brennan because I think the Fifth Amendment is important, that I think we shouldn't be cavalier. I don't think we should be casual in our disregard for the Constitution. I think that to allow the President to trample on and shred the Constitution and say that the Fifth Amendment no longer applies is a travesty, and it's something that we should not do lightly. So I think it's worth a discussion. So far it's sort of a one-way discussion, but we'll see. But it's worth a discussion that we talk about the Fifth Amendment. It says no person shall be deprived of their liberty, of their life or their liberty. That's what it means. It's pretty clear and it's pretty plain. You can't take away someone's life and liberty without due process or an indictment. So it should trouble every American. I can't imagine that there wouldn't be an American in our country that would not be troubled that we're talking about killing non-combatants in America with drone strikes. We have to get the President to respond to this. I don't think it's good enough for the President to say, I haven't done it yet, I don't intend to do it, but I might. His oath of office says he will preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. The oath of office doesn't say, well, I intend to when it's convenient. I mean, you know, I've never seen a president go out on the lawn with the Chief Justice and say, I intend to follow the Constitution when it's convenient. Because what he says is, he won't drop a Hellfire missile on you unless it's infeasible to capture you. That's what they're doing overseas. If that's going to be the standard for America, if you're not going to get a Hellfire missile on you unless it's infeasible, to me that sounds like unless it's convenient. If it's inconvenient, non-feasible sounds like inconveniency is the standard. You know, I asked Secretary Kerry about this in his nominating process. I said, well, can you go to war without Congress approving of it, without a declaration of war like the Constitution says? And he said, no, I intend to obey the Constitution, except for when I don't intend to obey the Constitution and when it's kind of, you know, it's hard to get things through Congress and Congress is so many squabbles and so many fights. So, yeah, most of the time we will come to Congress and we'll ask for a declaration of war, which, by the way, we have not done since World War I. And when we did was voted on nearly unanimously. We have not had a declaration of war. But this is the standard we get to. They don't intend to kill anyone, and we don't intend to go to war without a declaration of war unless it's impractical to get your approval. Well, that was the point. if you don't get the point of the Constitution, if you don't get the point of what kind of system our government set up, what kind of system our founders set up, it was to make it impractical. It was to make it difficult to go to war. It was to make it difficult and make it important there would be debate and checks and balances. If inconveniency is our standard for going to war without Congress, inconveniency is our standard for killing Americans on American soil with drones, I mean, I think we've sunk to a new low. I just can't imagine as a country that that's the standard you want to have. And I want to reiterate, this doesn't have anything to do with the president being a Democrat. Whether he was a Democrat or Republican, I don't question his motives. I've met the president several times. I really don't think he would do this. But the thing is I'm troubled by the fact that he won't tell us he won't. I mean, if he is a good man, and we believe him to be a good man that would never kill non-combatants in a cafe in Houston, you know, sitting out in a sidewalk cafe smoking, oh, that's right, you're not allowed to smoke cigarettes anymore, but let's say they're sitting in a cafe. If the president's not going to kill them, why wouldn't he just say he's not going to kill them there? That's the troubling aspect to this, is that if the president will not acknowledge that he's not going to kill non-combatants in America. The real problem also with this is we are now engaged in a limitless war. And a lot of Americans may not know this, but people all the time up here are saying it. You have to read between the lines sometimes to hear what they're saying. They're saying that there is no geographic limit to the war. That's what Brennan has said. What does that mean? I thought we went to war in Afghanistan. I really thought, even at the time, I wasn't here, but would have voted to go to war. I thought they were voting to go to war to get the people who attacked us on 9/11. I was all for it. I still am all for that. But we're now using that resolution to go to war to have no geographic limit for drone strikes anywhere in the whole world, but not only no geographic limit, no temporal limit, which means no timeline. There is no end to the war in Afghanistan. The war will never end. And if you have no geographic limit, many on my side say the battlefield's everywhere and the battlefield's in the United States. It's one thing to say that, but realize what they mean by that. They say because the battlefield is here, that the laws of war apply. That's what a drone strike is. A drone strike is not something you do domestically. They're saying the laws of war apply. Well, if you change the words around, what are the laws of war? Martial law. I think if you ask Americans, are you in favor of martial law by the president? I don't think many would be. But many in this body would gladly give up their power, would gladly say America's now the battlefield, and so the laws of war should operate. The laws of war are that there really is no due process in war. I'm not arguing for due process in war. I think it's frankly impossible. If you have gone as an American to Afghanistan and you're fighting against us, you don't get due process. You don't get your Miranda rights. It's an impossibility to have the Constitution operating in a battlefield. So I'm not for that, but I am against defining the battlefield as being everywhere, including my house, my office, including everywhere in America. If it's a battlefield, you have no rights. The war zone is a zone where you do not get due process. You do not get Miranda rights. You do not get an attorney. But it should be different in our country. If our country is a battlefield, if our country is a war zone, what's left? I thought we were fighting to preserve our way. I thought we were fighting to preserve and protect our Constitution. What are we fighting for if we're not going to protect our rights at home? The Bill of Rights is too important to scrap it. The Bill of Rights is too important to let any president, Republican or Democrat, simply come forward and say, well, I haven't broken the Constitution yet, and I don't intend to break the Constitution, but I might, because they're everywhere. And the battlefield's everywhere, and we're so frightened that we must do anything. I think it's good to be angry, upset, and really to even to want vengeance sometimes against people who attack you. I was all for, punishing those who attacked us after 9/11. But I think also at the same time, we need to not let that get in the way of, you know, what is our way of life and what are we protecting here. When we look at this and we look at what's going on with terrorism, we need to keep in perspective that these people can do us harm, but they're incredibly weak people. They're incredibly cowardly in a way. You know, they have no armies. They have the ability to inflict terrorism, which is what weak people do. People who have no armies and no strength attack civilians. It's a weak and cowardly way to attack your enemies. But it's not something that we should cower so much that we say, well, gosh, someday they may come and blow the Senate up, which would be terrible. I mean, I think the things that terrorists do are terrible, but I'm not saying that because we're so frightened of them coming that we say, well, why don't we just have camps again? You know, why don't we just round up? The Japanese Americans were a threat in the war. We just rounded them up, and we didn't have, guess what? No Japanese Americans attacked us, so it must have worked. I think it was an abomination what we did. It's one of the worst and most tragic episodes in our history, and the fact that our courts upheld it. But are we so frightened that we're going to give up on our Bill of Rights? Are we so frightened that the next thing we do is round up people who have a different color skin because we think, well, they've got cousins who live in Lebanon? You know? So we can't give up on what really makes America special. You know, what makes America special is the Bill of Rights. What makes us special is really that we're not a democracy. There are a lot of democracies around the world. We're a republic. We're a constitutional republic. We are a country that enshrined our rights, took care and deliberation, and wrote our rights down, and they're not supposed to be usurped by any majority. So it is important that we know that we're not a democracy. We're a constitutional republic. It's important for me to say and know that my rights came from my Creator. You don't have to agree with me on that. Some people think they came naturally to them, but they think that there's a natural state of being that is free. Now, we do give up some freedom. We give up some freedom to pay taxes. If I work, all of my labor is mine, and I give up some of my labor and some of my wages to a government. And to live in a civilized world, you do give up a little bit. But what I've always argued for is that we should minimize what freedom we give up. That's why you should always minimize taxes. You should minimize the size of your government, because everything you give up in taxes or everything you give up to your government is loss of your sweat equity, your labor. It's yours. It's nobody else's. So you give up a very minimum of it. Now, there's another argument. That's sort of the freedom argument for why we should keep government minimized. The other argument for why we should keep government minimized is more of an efficiency argument. And this comes from Milton Friedman, but I think he put it very succinctly. He said that nobody spends someone else's money as wisely or as frugally as you spend your own. It's a simple statement, but I think in one statement, one sentence, one simple sentence sort of, you know, brings forward something about government that's very true. People up here just don't spend it wisely. The reason they don't spend it wisely is it's not theirs, and they have no incentive. In fact, they have a perverse and wrong-headed incentive that says, I need to spend all of my money or I won't get it the next year. So government agencies incredibly want to spend all the money and more to make sure there's nothing left at the end of the year. Now, if you listen to some people, they would say, oh, no, government is just here to help people. Without government and without this massive, huge government that we have to have the debt because we need all the things we get from government. Will Rogers once wrote and said, be lucky you don't get all the government you're paying for. Now, George Will recently wrote, and he sort of put a twist on that, and he said that used to be true, but now I think you're getting more government than you pay for. That sort of is the truth now. We get a ton of government. Our taxes cover about 60–70% of what we spend up here. What kind of country gets rich borrowing 30 cents on every dollar? You know, what kind of country can, or what kind of family can spend 30% more that comes in? Some things are pretty simple. Wealth accumulation for you or wealth accumulation for a country is by savings. You don't get wealthy by spending more money than comes in. And so as we look to these things, I think we need to be cognizant of the reasons why we would want to have smaller, not bigger government. But we would have smaller government if we paid attention to the rules. The rules are very important, and when people talk about, oh, well, that would be a monarchy of the law, or they say that would be too rigid to live under the laws, we need a living, breathing, evolving Constitution. I think things change over time. You get new technologies, you know, drone strikes and things are new technologies. But I think what doesn't change are certain freedoms that are going to be the same now as they will be in 10,000 years. I think the freedom for people to worship is something that I don't want majority rule to decide. And you say, well, what does the freedom to worship have to do with drone strikes? Well, it's hard to worship after Hellfire missiles, you know, been launched on you. So the thing is that all of our rights, there's a panoply of rights. They're all interconnected, and they all come from sort of the basic right to life. If you don't have the right to be secure in your person, you don't have any other rights. So as we diminish one right, we attack at the foundation. But if we are at a foundation where we're saying that we can strike a person in America with no trial, with no accusation, I think we've come a long way from where we began. And I worry about it. I worry about it not just in the abstract sense, not just in the sense that, you know, these are a right in abstract and that we lose something that you can't actually touch or feel. I worry really about it in the sense that I don't know that how you continue to exist as a country if you don't believe in some fundamental rights, some fundamental right and wrong. After Obamacare passed and there were some questions about its constitutionality, they asked a representative from the House side, he was asked, well, what about the constitutionality? And he said, why would I care? Most of the things we do up here have no constitutional justification. We've gotten to the point where people care more about having enough votes. They think it's right if you have a majority vote here, as opposed to that there are certain immutable rights and wrongs, that there are certain immutable rights that were there at the founding of our country that will be there in 100 years or 1,000 years from now. Your right to be secure in your person, the right that your government can't take away these privileges. This is not a new fight. Really, from the beginning of time, there's been a struggle with the people versus the leaders. The leaders always want more. The amazing thing is it's sort of like a contagion. Not many people get to be president in this country. One person gets to be. We've had, in the 40s, 44, 45 presidents. We haven't had many presidents. But there's something contagious about the office. It's that power corrupts, I think. Lord Acton said that it's not just that power corrupts, but that absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think people can become intoxicated with power. I don't know if that's the explanation for President Obama's about face. He was one who, at a time when he was in this body, believed in some restraint, believed in Senate authority, believed in, actually didn't even believe in raising the debt ceiling when he was here. The thing is what we would hope for is someday to have a president who believed, even after assuming office, that the powers of the office should be protected. I think we run the risk, as we allow more and more power to gravitate to the president, we run the risk of living under an imperial presidency. Now, I've said some inflammatory statements that, you know, the president's acting like a king. Some of that is inflammatory and provocative, but some of it has some ring of truth to it, or I wouldn't get so much pushback. Kings operate by edict. They say it is so, make it so. There is no give and take. There is no checks and balances between the legislature and the presidency. This has been going on for a long time. It's a titanic struggle, and I wish, frankly, more people were interested in it. I wish we had a dozen people down here saying, no president should assume such authority. No president has the right to say that he is judge, jury, and executioner. No president should be allowed to say that. And it's not enough for him to say, my motives are good. I don't intend to do so. I haven't done so yet, but I might. If that's the standard we're going to live under, we have a great danger in our country. It's not enough. We live under the rule of law, and the law is quite explicit. The Fifth Amendment says no person shall be detained without an indictment or without due process. I find the answer to be incredibly easy. I've asked the President an easy question. My question is, can you kill an American on American soil, a non-combatant, with a drone strike? It should be an easy answer. But when a president won't answer a question, or when they answer the question, it's an evasive answer, your concern is yes. I really thought they would just never answer, but they finally did answer. And they answered my question. They said, yes, we can conceive of situations when we might. The situations they conceive of, though, are really attacks on the country, which I don't disagree with. So really, they're talking about things that are not controversial. If planes are attacking the Twin Towers or attacking New York or D.C., there's not any question on either side of the aisle, really among almost anybody in the country or the universe, who doesn't believe that you can repel lethal threats. What we're talking about is non-combatants eating dinner, sleeping in their house, walking down the street. A large percentage of the drone strikes have been people who were not carrying arms or in combat. Now, were they bad people? I'm not positive that I can tell you one way or the other, but I don't want that sort of standard to be used in America. I don't want the standard to be that if you're close to a bad person and you're a male between the ages of 16 and 50, that you're no longer a civilian, but that you were actually a militant. Is that the standard we're going to use in America? I don't want the standard to be sympathizing. You know, has anybody ever been on the Internet? Have you ever seen crackpots on the Internet who say all kinds of crazy things? If you're saying crazy things and they happen to be against your government, is that enough for a Hellfire missile to come down on your house? Is sympathizing enough? People have written about this and talked about the idea that during the Vietnam War, there were many people, and some of them, frankly, were treasonous and probably should have been tried for treason. But even having said that, I would never be for killing them without some sort of due process or trial. The idea of the right to trial by jury is something that really we've based our history for hundreds and hundreds of years have been based. This is a foundational principle for our country. I can't imagine that we would be so cavalier as to let it go. Hey. As we move forward with this nominating process, I've decided to occupy as much time as I can on the floor to bring attention. Ultimately, I can't win. There's not enough votes. There would be if truly there was an uprising of bipartisan support who would come to the floor and say, you know what, it's not really about John Brennan, it's about a constitutional principle, and we're willing to delay this until the President can explicitly answer that non-combatants in America won't be killed with drone strikes. I think it's a pretty simple answer. But it's been like pulling teeth, and I've written letter after letter for weeks and weeks trying to get an answer on this, and we haven't had much luck. There have been people who have written about the lawfulness of these lethal operations directed against citizens, and there's a question both in the country and outside the country. It's a question of what the standard will be. Will it be the same standard? Now, some say there's no standard once you get outside the country, that anybody can be killed whether they're an American citizen or not. I frankly don't like the idea of no standard. I think, for example, the most prominent American that's been killed overseas was Al Walkie. He was on a list, and his name was publicly known to be on a kill list for months. I see no reason why he couldn't have been tried in a federal court expeditiously. If he didn't return home, he'd still be tried, but given representation and tried for treason. These aren't real frequent cases overseas that have occurred, so I see no reason why we wouldn't use federal courts. The federal courts are adapted such that they can go into secret session if there's classified material. Federal courts in Washington, Philadelphia, New York have done this on occasion, and I think we could do this in federal court. We've tried and convicted quite a few terrorists, I think a number into the several hundreds in the United States in our courts. The main thing is that I object to people becoming so fearful that they cavalierly give up their rights. We had 2 terrorists in Bowling Green, Kentucky. My town has 50,000 people. Who would have thought we get 2 terrorists? And they were conspiring to either buy or send Stinger missiles to Iraq. And I'm glad they were caught, and I'm glad they were punished. They were done so in a court. But many people said, oh, let's just send them to Guantanamo Bay forever. And it's like, well, once we go down that path that we're not going to have any due process, our courts have done a pretty good job. In fact, I think we've not let off anybody from one of our courts that should have been kept here and tried. I do have some questions how these terrorists got to the country, and it goes back to, while we don't want terrorism to occur, how we should combat it, whether it's best combated by being in Yemen, Mali, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, or whether some of the way we ought to combat terrorism is to do a better job knowing who comes into our country and who leaves. For example, we've allowed 60,000 people from Iraq to come into this country in the last 2 or 3 years. I think that's a lot, frankly. They come here under asylum. The problem with asylum is, see, I thought asylum was when you were escaping dictatorship, when you were going to be persecuted by a dictator. Well, we won the war in Iraq. It's a democratic government over there, and I wouldn't understand why you'd be trying to leave a democratic government. Also, the 60,000 you leave, other than maybe the 2 we captured in Bowling Green, you would presume that most of them are pro-Western if they want to come over here. Those are the people we want running Iraq. You know, there's all kinds of reasons why they should stay in Iraq to run the country. But in letting so many people come in, we didn't do a very good job, because the 2 terrorists that we let in Bowling Green, their fingerprints were on an IED. And the IED was in a warehouse somewhere. And the interesting thing about it is they didn't find the fragments that their fingerprints was on and match it up in a database. After we caught them and we were trying them and we knew their name and had their fingerprints, we then went and directed towards some fragments that had been in a warehouse for years and years and had not yet been checked for fingerprints. So we're really not quite doing the job. Sometimes we want to analyze so much information that we get overwhelmed with the information too. We collect millions and millions and billions of pieces and bits of information, but it can't possibly all be analyzed. And some of it, I fear, goes against your rights to privacy. Any of your emails over 6 months can be looked at. We found out about this recently when we had an adultery affair in our military. And it's like, I think your third-party records are yours. So I had an amendment recently on this, and I told people that my Visa bill is pretty private. Just because I use my Visa card doesn't mean I've given up that information and the government should get to look at my Visa bill every month. But that's what we have done, and this has been going on. A lot of these things have been slipping away from us for a long time. They're not President Obama. They're 40 or 50 years of court cases. So like 30, 40, 50 years ago, we decided that once a third party had your records, they weren't yours and they weren't private anymore, which I think is an absurd notion. Think about the age we live in now and how a lot of people don't use cash at all. Your Visa card has everything on it. You can look at a person's Visa card, find out if they see a psychiatrist, what kind of medicines they're on sometimes. You can find out what kind of magazines they get, what kind of books they get, where they buy them from. You can look at a person's Visa bill and find out if they drink alcohol or if they gamble. You can find out their travel patterns. There's a lot. I mean, you can find out a ton of information about someone's Visa bill. Should people be able to look at your Visa bill without asking a judge and saying, we think he's involved in this? And see, I'm not saying you can't do this for a terrorist. But what you should do is you should go to a judge, you should present some evidence to say, we think he's a terrorist, we want to look at his Visa bill. Instead of saying, everybody in America your visa bill is open to scrutiny. That's basically what we have now. Your banking records, your visa statements, all of your records that are held by a third party are not protected. You may have heard some about they want to have cyber security. Well, everybody wants their computers to be secure, including the computer companies. They work nonstop trying to keep these hackers out of their computers. But the law they want to pass wants to give immunity to the computer companies. Well, a lot of us don't think much of it. We check off that confidentiality button, and we hope that we've signed the contract and they're not going to share our stuff. They share it in a way, but in an anonymous way with people you buy stuff from, and we put up with that in order to get a great search engine. And I'm okay with that. That's a private contract. But what I'm concerned with is that when we pass this cybersecurity, all of a sudden it's going to be, oh, well, you really can't sue them if they breach your privacy. So then we become everybody's computer, everybody's searches, everybody's reading habits are open to the federal government. It's once again, because we're fearful of people coming at us and fearful of attacks, we give up our rights. But I thought we were fighting to preserve our rights. So, then what are we fighting for? These battles are going on throughout government. The interesting thing about these battles is they're not really always Republican versus Democrat. These are battles that are sometimes really coalitions of people from the right and people from the left who've gotten together and fought on these things. On trying to get the president to acknowledge that he won't do drone strikes, there have been people on the Democratic side of the aisle who have allied with me and helped me to get some of this information. In fact, the president would have refused probably till hell froze over of giving me anything. But the fact that we got a few Democrats on there to ask for the information also, all of a sudden we had a coalition and we were able to get some information. But it hasn't been easy. And that's what's worrisome. The fact that they don't want to acknowledge limitation to the presidential power worries me that they believe in an incredibly expansive presidential power. In order to stop that, we've got to be protective of our rights. We've got to be able to not so easily give up on our rights. There's a white paper that was written, and the title of it was The Lawfulness of a Lethal Operation Directed Against a U.S. Citizen who's an operational leader of al-Qaeda or an associated force. This is from the Department of Justice. This white paper sets forth a legal framework for considering the circumstances in which the U.S. government could use lethal force. One of the things that they do in the document, and some of this was leaked recently, is they tell you the criteria for when they can kill people overseas. Now, we don't know the criteria for killing people in this country. They make a contention that the rules will be different, but no one's really acknowledging exactly who they can kill or what the rules will be. For the people who are killed overseas by drone strikes, the thing that they come up with is that they say that it has to be an imminent threat, but it doesn't have to be immediate. Well, to my thinking, only a bunch of government lawyers could come up with a definition for imminent that says it isn't immediate. So that's the first problem with it. Is that going to be the standard that's used in America? That has to be an imminent threat but doesn't have to be immediate. Because then my next question, what does that mean? Does that mean non-combatants who you think might someday be combatants are an imminent threat? I mean, it's a pretty important question. What is imminent? There's no question what is imminent lethal force. Someone aiming a gun at you, a missile, a bomb, any of these things is imminent, and no one questions that. No one questions using lethal force to stop any kind of imminent attack. But we become a little bit worried when the president says imminent doesn't have to mean immediate. And when that happens, and then when you see, from what we can tell from the unclassified portion of the drone attacks overseas, many of these people are not involved in combat. They might someday be involved in combat. They might have been involved in combat, but when we kill them, most of them are not involved in combat. So even overseas, there's some question of this program, but my questions are primarily directed towards what we do in this country. Now, it says that the U.S. government can use lethal force in a foreign country outside the area of active hostilities. That's once again the point. we're not talking about a battlefield. But because the battlefield has no limits, since the battlefield is not just Afghanistan, the battlefield has no geographic limits. So the battlefield is the whole world, including many in this body who say the battlefield is the United States. So once you acknowledge and admit that the battlefield is the United States, this whole idea of what's imminent versus what is immediate becomes pretty important, because we're talking about your neighbors now. The other thing about this is you need to try to understand who are these terrorists? Members of Al-Qaeda. There are no people walking around with a card that says Al-Qaeda on it. There are bad people. There were bad people associated with the terrorists. We've killed a lot of them who were in Afghanistan training and part of the group that attacked us. But there are terrorists all over the world that are unhappy with their own local government. Some of them are unhappy with us too. But to call them Al-Qaeda is sometimes a stretch, and sometimes open to debate who is and who isn't. But then they use other words, and words are important. Either a member of Al-Qaeda or associated forces. Now, I don't know what that means. Do you have to have talked to Al-Qaeda, or do you just have to be committing terrorism? Do you have to be in a country where we're supportive of the government and people are attacking the government? It's not always clear. The other question you get to when it's either Al-Qaeda or people associated is that now we get to the United States, and we have the government defining what they say is terrorism. So the government has put out some documents, one by the Bureau of Justice, to warn you of who might be a terrorist. In fact, the government has programs they want you to inform. They say, see someone, tell someone. If you see these people, you're supposed to inform on them. So some of the characteristics of people who might be terrorists, and I don't know, they don't have to be an imminent threat, so I don't know, doesn't have to be immediate, but some of these people might be terrorists. I don't know. If the president's going to kill these people, he needs to let them know. Some of the people who might be terrorists are people who are missing fingers. Some people have stains on their clothing. Some people have changed the color of their hair. Some of the people who have accumulated guns. Some people have accumulated weatherized ammunition, which might be half the hunters in the South this time of year, or people who might like to pay in cash, or people who have 7 days of food on hand. Well, I know people just for religious reasons, they are taught to keep food on hand. In fact, government websites sometimes tell you to keep food on hand for hurricanes. If you live along the coast, one government website says keep food on hand. The other government website says if you do, you might be a terrorist. Now, I'm not saying you are, but if these are the characteristics of terrorism, would you not be a little concerned that if the government's putting this list out, that we're going to drop Hellfire missiles from drones on people in America who might be on this other list? I'm particularly concerned about that. So I think we can't be sloppy about this. We can't allow ourselves to, be so, I guess, afraid of terrorism or afraid of our enemies that we give up on what makes us Americans. What makes us Americans are our constitutional rights, that these are enshrined in our Constitution. It's why we've gone to wars, to defend these rights. Will we think the war still has purpose if we're no longer able to enjoy these rights at home? The problem, as I see it, as we go forward, is that I wish I could tell you that there was an end to this, that there'd be a grand battle for your constitutional rights, or for what rights you lose overseas, what rights you lose here if you travel. The problem is they don't see an end to the war. They see perpetual war without geographic limits, and they see the battlefield here. So they want the laws of war to apply not only there, but to apply here. Another way of saying the laws of war is martial law. These are the laws of war. These are the laws that are accepted in war. But we accept a lot of things in the battlefield that we don't want to accept here. I acknowledge we accept you don't get Miranda rights in the battlefield. You don't get due process. You don't get an attorney. If you're shooting at us, we shoot back and kill you. But the thing is if you're sitting in a cafe in Houston, you do get Miranda rights. You do get accused of a crime. You do get a jury of your peers. That's what we're talking about here. The president should unequivocally come forward and state that non-combatants, people not involved with lethal force, will not have drones dropped on them. The other thing you should acknowledge is the law. Not only the constitutional law, but the law since the Civil War has said the military doesn't operate in the U.S. There's a reason for the military not operating in the U.S. Why? The military operates under different rules of engagement than policemen. The rules are stricter on policemen. We do it because we're not in a war here, so the policemen have to call judges. A lot of people don't think through this, though, and they'll say, well, these people are terrible. They're awful people who would cut your head off. You're right. They're really bad people. We have really bad people in our country, too, sometimes. We have murderers and rapists. But tonight at 4 a.m., if there's a rapist going around the neighborhood and you get to a house and there isn't an imminent thing going on, but you're told he might be in this house, before the door's broken down, they call on a cell phone, they get a judge out of bed, and they say, we've chased him into this neighborhood, no one's answering, we want to break the door down, can we have a warrant? And sometimes you don't need it for that situation, but most of the time in our country, the police have to call for a warrant. We have a process. But definitely when he's arrested, they don't just string him up. We don't have lynchings in our country. We don't let mobs decide who's guilty and who's not. I don't question the president's motives. I don't think the president would purposely take innocent people and kill them. I really don't think he'd drop a Hellfire missile on a cafe or a restaurant like I'm talking about. But it bothers me that he won't say that he won't. And it also bothers me that when he was a senator in this body and when he was a candidate, he had a much higher belief and standard for civil liberties, and that he seems to have lost that as he's become president. So I think this is an important issue. It goes beyond John Brennan. It goes beyond really the president. It goes to an issue that rises above, I think, all other issues that we consider here. I voted for 3 of the president's nominations, not because I agreed with them politically. In fact, I disagreed with the vast majority, but I disagree with the president on a lot of political issues. But I voted for his nominations because I think the president does get some prerogative in deciding who his political appointees are. I've chosen to make a stand on this one, and not so much the person, but the principle of this. I have nothing personally against Brennan. I have nothing personally against the president, but I have a great deal of concern about the rights that were enshrined in the Constitution. I have a great deal of concern about this slippery slope of saying that that there won't be accusations, there won't be trials, that we will just summarily execute people. And the question is, will you execute non-combatants? If he's not going to, he ought to say so. In this white paper that was released, they talked about the 3 different conditions. One of them was imminence, but then they qualified it by saying imminent doesn't have to mean immediate. Another one was feasibility. They said, you know, it's not feasible to get some of these people overseas, and so we kill them. But feasibility is to a certain extent, could be defined as convenience. And so the question is, in America, you know, what if they live up in the Rocky Mountains and there are no roads leading up to where they are? They're not very accessible. It's not very feasible. And so are we going to do strikes based on convenience? Is that going to be the standard? When we talk about standards, they say they have a process in place. But the process is very important. The standard is important. But it's also important that one group of people, one political group of people, or one politician doesn't get to decide that standard. That the standard, and part of the way a process in our country works is there are checks and balances between 3 branches of government, that one branch of government doesn't get to unilaterally decide what these standards are. Because some of the standards are a little bit loose. Whether or not you're near someone. Apparently we're not counting civilians who are killed by drone strikes if they're males between the ages of 60 and 50, if they were close to the person we were targeting, we just count them as other militants. Are we going to do that in the United States? If you're eating with 15 of your family members and one of them may or may not be communicating by email with somebody in a Middle Eastern country, can we just kill all 20 of you? And because some of you are within the right age group, that's fine. Or let's say you're eating with your cousin who is communicating with somebody in the Middle East, and that person may or may not be a bad person, and then when you leave, let's say you're going to a wedding, and you're going from a pre-party and there's 20 cars all going to the wedding, and they know, or they think they know, or there may be a bad person among you, why don't we just strike the caravan? These are called signature strikes. The Wall Street Journal said that the bulk of our drone strikes overseas are signature strikes. That's a good question for the President. Are signature strikes going to be the standard for killing Americans in America? The President simply says the rules will probably be different for inside than outside. Well, I frankly don't think that's good enough. He says he has no intent to kill Americans in America. I frankly don't think that's good enough. I don't think it's good enough for the President to say, I have no intention of breaching the Fifth Amendment. Intending not to is not the same as saying I won't. His oath of office says, I will not, or no, it says, I will protect, defend, and preserve the Constitution. It doesn't say, I intend to protect, preserve, and defend the Constitution, except for when it's infeasible or inconvenient. That's not what the rules are about. I think the rules are pretty absolute. The rules are, the Bill of Rights are yours. You got them from your Creator. They were enshrined in the Constitution. Nobody gets to take them from you. Nobody, no president from no party gets to be judge, jury, and executioner. This decision to let this go, to let this nomination go without an answer is a big mistake for us. If we do this, if we let this nomination go without a debate, without significant opposition, without demanding more answers from the President, the problem is we're never getting any more answers. There will be some in this body who say, well, just let it go, the snow's coming and we want to go home. The problem is that he's never going to answer these questions unless he's forced to. I suspect George Bush would have been the same. I suspect a lot of the presidents would be the same. And I think it's unfortunate, but they see their power and their sphere of power as being more important than your constitutional rights. But we won't get this by just the glad hand and the winning smile is not going to get any information from the President. The only way that this President would ever give us information is if we were to stop this nomination. And I'm not even saying stop it personally. My objection really is not so much to Brennan as being in charge of the CIA as my objection is to the program and to the President not admitting that he can't do drone strikes in America. So I will continue to do what I can to draw attention to this, and we'll see where things lead. But I am disappointed in the President. I am one who, while I'm a Republican, I didn't vote for him in 2008 or 2012. I am one who has admired certain aspects of his policy. I admired his defense of civil liberties. I admired him in 2007 when he said that Americans shouldn't be involved in torture. I admired him when he said that we should follow the rule of law and that we should have warrants before we tap people's phone, that we shouldn't be trolling through people's records. But I find a great irony and really, frankly, a great hypocrisy to someone who would defend getting warrants before we tap your phone but won't defend a trial before we kill you. You know, tapping one's phone is a breach of your privacy, and it should only be done if you've been accused of a crime and evidence has been presented and a judge grants a warrant. But killing someone with no due process, with no judicial oversight? Now, some are saying in here, oh, we'll get to it. We're eventually going to set up a court, maybe a FISA court, which unfortunately probably won't be quite good enough because it'll be in secret, and you really should have a chance to confront your accusers and have a public trial if you're going to be killed. Particularly what I'm talking about is American citizens. But there needs to be some oversight. But the problem with waiting to do this and saying, oh, you know, we'll do this, you know, sometime, we'll get to it eventually, it never happens. Same way with saying, oh, we'll keep asking the president for more information, but it never happens. You know, if we do not take a stand for something we believe in, it's going to slip away from us. I think our rights are gradually eroding. I think they're gradually slipping away from us. I think the understanding of the Constitution as a document that restrains your government, that restrains the size and scope of your government, has been lost on a lot of people. And I think it's something we shouldn't give up on. When the president goes through his 3 different items that were leaked through this memo, he says there has to be an imminent threat. He says the capture has to be inconvenient or infeasible. And he says that the operation of killing the person has to be conducted within a manner consistent with the applicable law of war. Here's the problem. That sounds fine if you're in Afghanistan in the mountains fighting a war. But I'm talking about downtown Washington, D.C., talking about living in the suburbs of Houston or Atlanta. Are we going to have drone strike programs in America consistent with the applicable law of war? See, the other way to put law of war, and this isn't a stretch, this is just turning the words around, martial law. Now, people, if you put it that way, might have a little bit different impression. Do we want martial law in our country? If you go back to, you know, the battle we had over indefinite detention last year, where they're saying they can take a citizen without a trial and actually send them from America to Guantanamo Bay if they're accused of terrorism, accused, not convicted, accused of terrorism, you start to worry about some of this stuff happening, you know, in our country, that this could actually happen. One of the sort of ironies of looking at different governments and looking what makes people unhappy, in Tahrir Square in Cairo, there have been hundreds of thousands of people protesting. And it's interesting what they're protesting. They're protesting, one of the large things they protest is something called an emergency decree, which I believe went in place by Mubarak 20-some-odd years ago. So you get leaders who come in and they're fearful, or they use fear to accumulate power, and you get a decree. So you get martial law. The martial law, ironically enough, in Egypt, allows detention without trial. They do have the right to trial, but there's an exception, and it's been accepted for the last 20-some-odd years, and the people are hopping mad over it. So we get involved in their country and their politics and give them money and weapons, and we've got some of the same debate and problems here at home, you know, and whether or not you can indefinitely detain. You know, the president's response to this was also pretty disappointing. It wouldn't have become law without him. I think he threatened to veto it, and then he signed it anyway. Empty threats are of no value, and he struck no great blow for America or for American freedoms by not vetoing this. But when he signed it, he said something similar to what he's saying now. He said, well, I have no intent to indefinitely detain people. Am I the only one in America that's a little bit, you know, underwhelmed by the president saying he has no intent to detain somebody, but he's going to sign it into law saying he has the power to? That's the same thing we're getting now in this drone strike program. Don't worry. Everything's okay. I'm your leader, and I would never detain you. I would never, you know, shoot Hellfire missiles at non-combatants. I won't do that. And I can take him at his word, but what about the next guy and the next guy? In 1923, when they destroyed the currency in Germany, they elected Hitler. I'm not saying anybody's Hitler, so don't misunderstand me. I'm saying that there is a danger, even in a democratic country, that someday you get a leader who comes in the middle of chaos and says, those people did it. Those people were the mistake. Those people are who we need to rout out. And if the laws have been removed that prevented that from happening, if the laws have been removed that say we can indefinitely detain, in Hitler's case, he said the Jews, those bankers, the Jews did this to us, and they were indefinitely detained. Now, am I saying that's going to happen in our country? Unlikely. I can't imagine any of our leaders, for all of our disagreements, doing that. But if you don't have the law to protect you, you don't have that protection. Because you do not know who the next guy is, and the next guy, the next woman. When Madison wrote about this, he was very explicit. He said, we have these rules in place because we don't have a government of angels. If we had a government of angels, we wouldn't need these rules. And I'll never forget the discussion with somebody about the Kelo case. The Kelo case was a case where the government took private property and gave it to a richer person who had private property that wanted to develop it. Ironically, the justification they use is blight. So they take it from one middle-class person and give it to a rich corporation, and they say they're doing that to rectify blight. But when they did that, and when they came down with a ruling on this, it was concerning the logic of the way they get to this ruling, that basically that you really don't have this right to your property. And when the Kelo decision came down, it really bothered me. But I remember we started having the battle in our local government, and in our local government there was a battle over a resolution, and the resolution said, it was in the city council, the resolution said that the local city government can't take private land and give it to another person. It was really, like so many other things, the intention of eminent domain was to build highways and have thoroughfares that you might not be able to get otherwise. But it was never intended to take from a private owner and give to a corporation. And that's what they did with the Kelo decision. So anyway, local governments began talking about this, and I was talking to one of my local government officials, this is probably 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and their response was, but I would never do that. I would never take private land through eminent domain and give it to another corporation. I would never do that. So really, I believe that person. And I really, frankly, give the President the benefit of the doubt. I don't question his motives. I don't think he probably will kill non-combatants. But I certainly don't want him to claim that he has the authority to kill non-combatants. So this is a big deal. It's a huge deal. So with the eminent domain, we finally passed it in our local commission. It was like 3-2. But in my town in Kentucky, you can't take private property through eminent domain and give it to another private individual. Because it is not about the individuals involved. It's about the fact that we don't always have angels running our government. We don't always know who we're going to get. If we look through and we ask the question, do you want a government that is run by majority rule or a government that's restrained by its documents? It's a pretty important question. And ultimately, there are ramifications to majority rule, to basically whatever the majority wants. One, the majority can vote upon minorities, rules they don't pass on themselves. In fact, Martin Luther King wrote, this is one of my favorite quotes from him, he said that an unjust law is any law that a majority passes on a minority but doesn't make binding on themselves. Now, I thought it was a great statement because you could probably almost apply that to any law written on any subject. If the law excludes certain people and isn't applied to everyone, then by definition it's an unjust law. What a great way to put it succinctly, and a great way that we should look as far as trying to write rules. But you have to decide as a country whether you want majorities or politicians to decide things, or whether you want reliance on documents and on a process and on a rule of law that protects you. I think if we rely on basically the whims of politicians, I think it's a big mistake. You know, if we're going to rely on the politician basically sitting in the Oval Office going through flashcards and a PowerPoint presentation to make the decision on life and death for Americans in America. I think it's a huge mistake. Any people who watch trials and court cases realize that even courts aren't perfect. And it's actually amazing how we even get it wrong with courts and trials and juries. Many states and even many people who are for the death penalty have questioned their support of the death penalty because of the imperfection of our courts. You know, through DNA testing, we found we don't always get it right, even with that. I think in Illinois they stopped the death penalty after having so many DNA testings that showed that there was incorrect diagnosis of who had committed the crime. And so the question becomes is, even with all the checks and balances of the court, are you worried at all about having one politician accuse, secretly charge, I guess if you can call it a charge, and then execute Americans? I'm incredibly troubled by that. I can't imagine that we as a free country would let that stand. I mean, I think it's an insult to every soldier in uniform fighting for American freedom around the world that we would just give up on ours at home. That the president would cavalierly or incorrectly or without forethought, without sufficient forethought, not tell us, not go ahead and explicitly say this will never happen in America. His answer to me shouldn't have been, no, we won't kill non-combatants. It should be never, no, never. We will never in America come to that. Under my watch, we will never, ever allow this to happen in America. It's incredibly disappointing. It should be disappointing to all Americans or anyone who believes in this. We have to realize that trying to figure out guilt or innocence is very complicated. Anybody who's ever served on a jury realizes how difficult it is to determine guilt. And sometimes you're unsure. In some cases are actually decided by, gosh, the evidence was so equal, but there wasn't a preponderance. I couldn't become completely convinced, and this person's going to be put to death. Contrast that, the feeling that a juror has and what a juror is trying to do in finding innocence or guilt and letting someone be punished by death, contrast that with our current standard. Our current standard for killing someone overseas is you can be sympathizing, you can be close to people who we think are bad, you can be in a caravan that we say bears the signature of bad people. Now, there's another debate that can be had about whether those are sufficient standards for war. And the standards are different for war and our country. But we have to adamantly and unequivocally stand up and say to those who would say this is a battlefield, the hell it's a battlefield, this is our country. If you want to say that this is a battlefield, if you say that we're going to have the laws of war here, we're going to have martial law here, by golly, let's have a debate about it. Let's have a discussion in the country. Let's have everybody talking about, are we the battlefield? Is this a battlefield? Is our country a battlefield? Because what that means is you get no due process in a battlefield. And I'm not here to argue and say that you get due process in a battlefield. I'm here to argue that we can't let America be a battlefield because we can't say that we're no longer going to have due process, that we're no longer going to have trial by jury, that we're no longer going to have presentment of charges and grand juries. It is impossible in a battlefield. In Afghanistan, it's impossible to say, hey, wait a minute, can I read you your Miranda rights? It is impossible. We're not arguing for that. We're not arguing for a judge or a jury or anything else. If people are shooting at our troops, they can do everything possible, including drone strikes. It's not even the technology so much that I'm opposed to, but the technology opens doors that we need to be concerned with. Defense of our soldiers in war, there's no due process involved with that. But realize the danger to saying America is the war. America is the battlefield. Because also realize the danger that these people, they're Republicans and Democrats, these people don't believe there's any limit to the war. There is no geographic limit, and there is no temporal limit. It's a perpetual war, and many of it, if you prompt them or provoke them, they will open up and say, oh yeah, America's a battlefield, we need the laws of war, and you ask them, when's the war going to end? When will we win the war? They'll admit it. Some of them will frankly admit it. They will say, well, the war goes on, it may go on for a long time. Some have talked about 100 years war, 100 years being in these countries. But basically, we're talking about perpetual war. We're talking about a war with no geographic limit, no temporal limit, and a war that really has come to our country. Now, there will be bad people who come to our country who we need to repel. We're not talking about that. If planes are being flown into the Twin Towers, we have the right to shoot them down with our military. That's an act of war, and no one questions that. If someone is standing outside the Capitol with a grenade launcher, we have a lot of brave Capitol policemen, and I hope that they kill the person immediately. Lethal force, to repel lethal force, has never been questioned by anybody and is really not even controversial. But they want to make the debate about that and not about killing non-combatants driving in their car down Constitution or sitting in a cafe on Massachusetts Avenue. Now, there may be bad people who are driving in their car, and there may be bad people sitting in cafes around the country. If there are, accuse them of a crime, arrest them, and try them. The battlefield coming to America or acknowledging that is an enormous mistake. So there are some big issues here, some issues that we as a country, I think, gloss over. You watch the nightly news and there's sometimes so much hysteria about so many issues, so many people yelling back and forth. But this is really an issue that I think if we could get a frank discussion. I've proposed to the leadership, I haven't had much luck with this, but I propose that for a constitutional debate or a debate of importance that everybody come, and instead of hearing me for all day, we take 2 or 3 minutes and we go around the room and everybody speaks, and it's limited, but there's some kind of debate and discussion, less speech making and more debate. I propose that we have lunch together. I've asked to come to the Democratic lunch. I haven't got the invitation secured yet. That's only been 2 years, so it may happen. But there's many reasons for discussion. There's many reasons why we should have civility. There's many reasons why people on both sides of the aisle can agree to this. If we were to have a vote, maybe not on the nomination, but a vote on restricting drones. There is a bill out there that we're working on that would restrict drones to imminent threats and really doesn't even get into the distinction of the military. Things in the country would be the FBI. It wouldn't be the military because that's the law, and there's an important reason for the law. But we have a bill that we're going to come forward with that we're working on that would simply say that there has to be a real imminent lethal threat, something you can see. Which then I think people could agree to that, because it's not so much the drone that we object to. If some guy's robbing a liquor store 2 blocks from here, and the policemen come up and he comes out brandishing a gun, he or she can be shot. They, once again, don't get Miranda rights, they don't get a trial, they don't get anything. If you come out brandishing a weapon and people are threatened by it, you can be shot. So it's important to know what we're talking about. We're not talking about the guy coming out of the liquor store with a weapon. Even a drone could kill him if the FBI had drones. So my objection to drones isn't so much the technology. There may be a use for law enforcement here, but there are also great potential for abuses. Many government agencies have become buying drones, and these hopefully will remain unarmed drones, and it's a different subject, but it's a subject that sort of dovetails from this into the next subject, which is, should you have protection from the government snooping, from the government looking through your bedroom windows? And I remember when I read 1984, when I was in high school, it it bothered me, but I really couldn't quite connect. And I felt somewhat secure in the sense that, well, we didn't have two-way televisions. This is back in the 1970s. We didn't have the ability to look at people, and the government couldn't look at me in my house 24 hours a day. And you could kind of get the feeling for how terrible it would be for that to happen, but technology was behind that. And actually 1984 was written, I think, in 1949. So really, talk about, really being able to foresee the future. But now, fast forward another 30 or 40 years and look at the technology we have now. We have drones that are less than an ounce. Presumably with cameras. I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that. But less than an ounce with a camera. It is not impossible to conceive that you could have a drone fly outside your window and see what you're reading, to see what your reading material is. It's not impossible to say that they couldn't send drones up to your mailbox and read at least your, what kind of mail you're getting or where it's from. It's not inconceivable that drones could follow you around. Now, we had an important Supreme Court case last year, though, that was a blow for privacy. And this was a Supreme Court case that had to do with GPS tagging. GPS, everybody knows what GPS is, but what they were doing is the police were shooting them onto cars or tagging them when you weren't with your car and then just following you around waiting for you to commit a crime. Well, if you tag everybody's car and wait for them to speed, we're going to have some big deal on fines. There's going to be a problem. That's just a problem to following people around waiting for people to commit a crime. So the Supreme Court ruled, and I think it was unanimously, that you have to have a warrant to do that. The thing about surveillance is those of us who believe in privacy aren't arguing against any surveillance. What we're arguing is that you have to have a reason to do it, and you have to ask a judge for permission. So it isn't a society where there is no surveillance or a society where you have absolute privacy. If you commit a crime, they go to the police, go to the judge, and they ask for permission to do this. But there are some worrisome things about direction of drones. For example, the EPA now has drones, and the EPA is flying drones over farmland. I think some of this may be even in the defecation patterns of the cows. I don't know exactly what they're looking for because manure in streams is said to be a pollutant, and actually, frankly, thousands of animals might. But the whole idea is if you think someone is dumping anything in a stream, and I'm not opposed to having laws stopping that, get a warrant, search them, or get a warrant and spy on them with a satellite. I mean, a satellite or a drone or however you want to do it. But you have to have some kind of probable cause they're committing a crime, because you can imagine that we would devolve into a society where every aspect of our life would just be open to the government to watch what we're doing. Now, they say there's something called an open spaces concept. They say, well, you've got 40 acres and the land is open, so it's not really private anymore. Well, I think that's absurd. I think that's sort of analogous to the whole banking secrecy. It's like, oh, you gave your records to your bank, so you don't really care if anybody looks at them? That's absurd. I have a 40-acre farm and I go hunting out there, but I just, I'm supposed to not care if people watch me, everything I do once I'm outside of my house. My privacy is only inside my house and not in open spaces. I disagree with that. One of the interesting things about the right to privacy, and you'll actually get some disagreement, people on the right about this, there was a case called the Griswold case, and it had to do with birth control. And a lot of conservatives object to it because they saw it as a building block for the Roe v. Wade. Now, I'm pro-life and didn't like the decision in Roe v. Wade, but actually don't mind the decision in Griswold so much. And the reason is, going back to a little bit of the discussion we had earlier on Lochner, is that with Griswold, what I see is that they talked about a right to privacy. Now, some said, the conservatives who are worried about the judiciary coming up with new things or creating new things, is they thought the right to privacy wasn't in the Constitution, so you really don't have it. And I think that's a mistaken notion because, for example, the right to private property, that's not in the Constitution either, but I don't think any of the Founding Fathers or most of us today would argue you don't have a right to private property. In fact, I think it's one of the most important parts. In fact, there was some debate over having it in there. But the thing is that I think the right to privacy, the right to private property, they're part of what I would call the unenumerated rights. And the unenumerated rights are basically everything else not given to the government. You gave the government, or we give the government, through the compact of the Constitution, we give the government enumerated powers. There's about 17 to 19, depending on how you count them, but they're, as Madison said, few and defined. When you talk about the rights, though, the 9th and 10th Amendment will say that those rights not specifically delegated to the federal government are left to the states and the people, respectively. And they're not to be disparaged. So the interesting thing about your rights is that there isn't sort of a list of your rights. And in fact, when the Founding Fathers were putting together the Bill of Rights, one of the objections to the Bill of Rights were that they said, oh, if we put the Bill of Rights together, everybody will think that's all of the rights, and they'll think if it wasn't listed, you don't get it. So the 9th and 10th Amendment were a really important part of it. In fact, I don't know that I would have voted for the Bill of Rights inclusion if you didn't have the 9th and 10th. I mean, I like all the others, of course, but the 9th and 10th then protect all those not mentioned. And so it's an interesting thing that some on the right disagree. In fact, the majority don't like the Griswold decision, but I actually kind of like it because I think your right to privacy is yours. Same way I think your right to private property is yours. It wasn't delegated, it wasn't taken, it wasn't given to the federal government. It is yours. It gets back to sort of the primacy of liberty, the primacy of your individual freedom, that you didn't get that. You weren't given your freedom by government. It's something that was yours naturally, whereas many of us believe it comes from your Creator. So your rights are natural and inborn. They were enshrined in the Constitution, not given to you, but enshrined and protected. And as Patrick Henry said, it's not that these rights or not that the Constitution was instituted among men to protect the government. They were to protect the people from the government. It was to limit the size of government, to try to restrain the size of government, to try to allow for a government that lived under a rule of law. And when Hayek said that nothing distinguishes arbitrary government from a constitutional government more clearly than this concept of the rule of law. The important thing about the rule of law is also that the rule of law is something that it gives us certainty, and businessmen have talked about certainty. And without relinquishing the floor, I would like to hear a few comments from Senator Lee.
The issues that we're